Accession number 10044, Reel 1.
Mr. Powell, Reel 1.
I am fairly sure from recollection that in the very early years of the 1930s, I tended, as did I think most people at that time, to regard France as the most problematic of the European nations, and to think that danger to Britain and to the British Empire was more likely to come from that quarter. But certainly this perspective had changed by 1934. I would associate that with the Röhm massacre, which disclosed for those with eyes to see the nature of a new German state. And I can definitely date in 1935 my decision, which I remember informing my father of, that I would be in the war which was going to come again from day one. By then I think I was already in residence again as a fellow at Cambridge, after 2 years spent travelling on the continent, which had given me a considerable insight into the state of feeling and the degree of rising tension on the continent.
Which places had you visited?
I was primarily working in Italy, but I lived in a German house in Venice, and I was in close contact by correspondence and by meetings in Italy with German scholars. Indeed, it was in May 1935 that I made the acquaintance of a German scholar, a very distinguished German scholar, who as a Jew had been deprived of his professorship at Königsberg in East Prussia, and I was subsequently believed to have had something to do with facilitating his departure from Germany immediately before the outbreak of hostilities in September 1939.
And had you in fact helped him?
Well, I certainly visited the British consulate in Berlin in December 1938, when I paid a visit to Germany and to East Prussia, and when I stayed with him in East Prussia. I'd certainly made an exploratory visit to the British consulate at that time. But since, during the material period, the critical period in 1939, I was in Australia, it's pretty clear to me that but for the action of others, and particularly Mr. Sysom, who was secretary to the delegates of the Oxford University Press, it's unlikely that Professor Maas, that was his name, Powell, P-A-U-L, Maas, M-A-A-S, would have been persuaded to take the opportunity of leaving Germany. However, I was talking about 1935, when I came back into residence in Trinity College, Cambridge, as a fellow, with a full conviction that there would be a resumption, I thought sooner than 4 years, in the hostilities which had terminated in 1918. Accordingly, I sought an interview with Colonel Murray, who was the Commandant of the Officer Cadet Training Unit of Cambridge University, and told him that I wanted to be sure that my services were available at the beginning of the war, and that I was willing to undergo any military training in advance which might be required. At a second interview, he told me that I wouldn't need to take further any military training. Indeed, I had none. I had no Certificate A and did not belong to the corps at school in Birmingham. But that my name had been placed on the list and that my services would be called for at the outbreak of war and would be fully utilized. I did not at the time form the conjecture which I naturally form now, that Bletchley might have been my destination had that opportunity been availed of. However, in 1937, I was appointed Professor of Greek in the University of Sydney and left in February 1938 to take up my post. When I arrived in Sydney, incidentally, I travelled to and from Sydney twice by Imperial Airways flying boat, and was indeed on the first flying boat which ever went with passengers east of Karachi. I remember that particularly because it was the first time in my life that I had ever been in the air. And having spent 10 days getting to Singapore, landing on water 4 or 5 times a day, I fell asleep after leaving Singapore and awoke to find the aircraft, which was of course a land-based 4-engine de Havilland, coming down on an airfield. I assumed that this was the disaster which I had naturally anticipated, and then only later realized that aircraft landed on land as well as on water. However, at my first interview with the Vice-Chancellor, and taking up my post in February 1938, I informed him that it was my intention to resign and return to the United Kingdom as soon as the United Kingdom went to war, a declaration which he received with great astonishment, there being even at that time not the general expectation of imminent hostilities in Australia, which might well have been expected back in the United Kingdom.
Could I ask you here about this firm commitment to do this, because many people might have easily passed it by. Why do you think that you had such a strong commitment to doing what you did?
Since the middle 30s and before, quite apart from a general patriotic attitude towards the defence of my country, I had acquired a great hatred as well as fear of Germany. Indeed, when in the event I did return home, I returned home not believing it likely that we would succeed in defending ourselves against a Germany whose military power had developed to the point which it had reached in 1939. There was indeed in Australia an unreal sensation in those 2 years of 1938 and 1939, as though all that was happening in Europe was happening in a different world altogether. And I remember writing a poem in which I said that I alone could hear through the core of the earth the feet of the German divisions marching and counter-marching in Europe. Well, it was in August 1939 that, after dining with Sir Hugh Murray in Sydney, who was on his way to take up the governorship of Papua, and who, having just returned from London, assured me that there would be no war, that I embarked for a visit to the university colleges in New Zealand. In Otago, which was my last port of call, I found a very lively expectation of danger from the side of Japan. And certainly the sensation of being under threat was much livelier in New Zealand than I had left it behind me in Australia. It was on the boat returning from Wellington to Sydney that on the 3rd of September I heard the news with immense relief that Britain had declared war on Germany. I say immense relief because one's mind had been overshadowed by the fear that somehow the United Kingdom might be hustled from one position to another and in the end be overwhelmed without fighting. The real sense of sickening anticipation of going under without fighting was finally ended by the news on the 3rd of September.
Could I ask you here to say something more specifically about your attitude towards the policy of Chamberlain's government and also what Winston Churchill was doing in the way of campaigning against it?
I was not very much aware of Winston Churchill, but I certainly detested Baldwin and even more Chamberlain for the unrealism of their attitude to Germany. From my contacts with the continent and with Germany, to which allusion has already been made, I had no doubt whatsoever as to the nature of the power with which we were dealing in Nazi Germany, nor with the significance of the Axis alliance, which would involve Britain's communications in the Mediterranean, quite apart from the direct threat to Britain in the North Sea and by hostilities against France. So it was a sense of my country being threatened by an immense evil and probably overweening power that I was motivated.
When you talked earlier about your fear of Germany, was it a fear of Germany or a fear of Nazism, or were you not distinguishing?
It was a fear of my country being defeated and occupied and governed by a victorious enemy, of Britain suffering in the different circumstances the fate of the defeated in the First World War. And of course one must remember that in 1939 war meant a continuation of where we had left off in November 1918. There was no other material by which the reality of war could be imagined. But I will come to that presently when I refer to my own enlistment. My first concern was to avoid being kept behind in Australia. I landed in Sydney on the 4th, spent the whole day on the streets to avoid being contacted by telephone, slipped into my room in the university at dead of night on the night of the 4th, wrote my letter of resignation, interviewed my lecturer and handed over to him, and disappeared again. From then until the morning of the 6th, I spent my time away from a telephone and as far as possible out of contact, calculating that if people were inquiring for me with a view to my being required for wartime work in Australia, I might at least evade it by being unobtainable in the first few days of the war. But it was with great relief that I got on board the flying boat with my return ticket, for I'd already spent the winter, that is to say the Australian long vacation of 1938 to 39 in Europe, with my return ticket for London. But I was even more relieved when the flying boat 3 or 4 days later left Darwin, and I supposed myself to be out of reach of the Commonwealth authorities. I was, after all, at that time professor in the University of Sydney. I took with me on my journey Russian books. I had been acquiring Russian for 2 or 3 years. I initially did so because in 1937 I had the intention of visiting Moscow to read a certain Greek manuscript in the library of a Holy Synod in Moscow, which they were unwilling to lend for the purpose to a library in the United Kingdom. But I'd persisted with my learning of Russian and took with me my Russian books to work at on the flight back to London, being convinced that in a conflict with Germany it was Russia, despite the Ribbentrop-Molotov concordat, that would hold the key to our survival and our victory. It was Russia that would be the decisive power.
Could I ask you at this point
Yes.
what your attitude towards the Soviet system was?
I don't think I was an admirer of the Soviet system. I don't think I had starry eyes through which I contemplated Soviet Russia. I think I was aware of the nature of dictatorial states. Indeed, I lived with the smell of, and could recognize the smell of dictatorship on the continent of Europe, but I regarded Russia as the nation which, in 2 world conflicts, by its very existence, had been the means of England surviving in 1812 and in 1916. And if Satan was a necessary ally for defeating Germany, then Satan let it be, and I by no means equated even Soviet Russia with Satan, as I did equate Nazi Germany as a satanic power.
What had been your reaction then to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact?
I saw that it had brought into much greater imminence the outbreak of direct war directly between Britain and Germany. That in itself seemed to me no bad thing, as my view was that with every month that passed, the balance would tend to tilt against Britain and Britain's allies and in favour of Germany. But I suppose I was unsurprised by the cynicism of the Russian state. It seemed to me that the Russian state understood very well the danger which Germany posed to it and was cynically taking the advantage of circumstances in which it could provide itself with greater depth and strengthen its ultimate position. I can't absolutely be certain that my answer to that question, like most answers to similar questions, is not coloured by hindsight, but I've done my best to reconstruct the comparative indifference and certainly the absence of indignation with which I greeted the compact between Germany and Russia.
Who did you blame for the pact?
I suppose, had that question been put to me in 1939, I would have said a Britain which has shown itself so insensitive to the rising threat from Germany can hardly blame Russia if Russia takes such steps as will conduce to its own defense in a foreseeable emergency. I would probably have said in the long run the cause must rest with those whom Russia has decided to write off as not serious.
Britain and France?
Britain and France. I was one of those who was deeply dismayed by Munich. I was in Australia at the time, and I remember the shame with which with which I was struck by that news. And I also remember, on entering Germany in December 1938, after the Munich Pact, my sense of shame at my passport disclosing that I was British, although I was treated with total courtesy by the German authorities with whom I had to deal. Nevertheless, I felt that a stigma had been placed upon me as British by the events of September 1938.
Did you expect the German-Russian pact to last?
I suppose that expecting it to precipitate further German military activity and consequently the likelihood of British intervention, I regarded the future of a pact as likely to be determined by events further west, by the development of a military situation in the West.
Could I ask you if you had read Mein Kampf?
No. But I'd read enough to know what Nazism was about, and having been for 3 weeks in Germany in the winter of 38-39, mainly living with Jews, I had no delusions as to the nature of the state with which one was concerned. Not that I hadn't had learnt the primer in fascist Italy and was able to recognize very well the marks of a fascist state and its behavior towards its own citizens.
Did you get into arguments in those days with British or other Western people who argued that really Hitler was only a threat to the East and not to the West?
I have two memories which your question evokes. One is of a furious argument in Florence in 1935 he was, I think, an employee of a British council who was advocating the policies of a British Union of fascists and arguing that Britain had better wake itself up and adopt similarly efficient regimes to that which existed in Germany and Italy. That I remember. I also remember from 1937 onwards being personally angry with those who contemplated with indifference and even with some satisfaction the rise of Germany's aggressive military power. I think it must have been in 1937 that at a college feast in Trinity, where I was present as a fellow of the college, the guest of the evening, who I think was Lord Wright, saying in the course of his speech, "Of course, our government is doing its best to keep the peace." And I remember banging my fist on the table and saying, "What we need is war, we need war."
What
that
kind
would
of
be dated
response?
at 19... I suppose that was just regarded as a rather quixotic fellow having his say. I also remember, stimulated by those two recollections, again in 1937, it must have been, before I went to Australia, being driven up by Gilbert Murray from Oxford to his home on Boars Hill. We were driving up in his open car, and I said, "I believe there is no alternative to war with Germany, and that the sooner we have war with Germany, the better." And I remember, as if it were today, his turning round as he drove and looking me straight in the face and saying, "I think so too."
Why do you think it was that your own feelings weren't dominated by the fear of Bolshevism as the feelings of so many people were in the late 30s?
I don't think I regarded Russia as a militarily aggressive power. I knew that it was a great military power, but I didn't think it was a power which could be effective as an aggressor against the United Kingdom, nor even against the British Empire. There was to me a profound difference between Germany, with its intellectual and historical background, aspiring to the domination of Europe, and a Russia which historically had never aspired to dominate Western Europe.
Had you done much study of the traditions of British foreign policy at that time?
I think I had read my way through British history as well as diplomatic history through the previous 2 centuries. I was certainly familiar with the anxiety which Britain, as the British Empire in India, had felt over the presence of Russia on the other side of Afghanistan and the Himalayas. I was familiar enough with that. But it seemed to me that this had been superseded by the rise of the Bismarckian German Empire, and that a German ambition to dominate Europe and to crush the nationhoods of France and Britain was something not too wild to imagine. A similar ambition on the part of Russia seemed to me to be unimaginable.
Could I ask you about your attitude at that time towards the British Empire? What was it then? Was it what we might describe as the orthodox type of view in the late 30s?
The journey to Australia by flying boat had been an immense revelation to me. It was a living geography and imperial lesson. And though India didn't, on passing through it in 38 and 39, cast over me the spell which it later did, the sense of the extraordinary sense of the inevitability, an apparently strange word to use, of British power was very strongly borne in upon me. It seemed to me that the combination of sea power and air power, which Britain still exhibited, gave to the structure of a British Empire an inherent strength, which I was later to learn it didn't possess. But I was imbued with the sense that what we were fighting for against Germany was not only the safety and freedom of a self-governing United Kingdom, a parliamentary, democratic United Kingdom, but was also the integrity of the worldwide structure of the British Empire. I've been reminded, though I wouldn't have remembered it of my own accord, I've been reminded in the last 2 or 3 years, and when one is reminded, one can sometimes re-excavate in one's own mind that of which others have reminded one, that in 1935, when Italy invaded Abyssinia, I inquired of the college authorities whether if I volunteered to fight on the Abyssinian side, my fellowship could be put into suspense. I only say that that was reported to me by a surviving fellow of those days who had been senior bursar at the time, and he appeared to be quite clear that such a thing had happened, and I would not regard it as totally impossible that I had entertained that sense of hostility towards fascist Italy as threatening Britain's command of communications in the Middle East, and particularly the Suez Canal.
But as far as the British Empire is concerned, did you have the idea that Britain had a civilizing mission?
I think I shared the orthodox, and it is orthodox for the British in the way that it never was for the French or other European colonizing powers, the orthodox British view that where you governed, there you put yourself as far as possible within the skin, within the culture of those whom you governed, and that it was the natural business and the natural aspiration of the British proconsul to represent, as it were, the people of that country. The British tradition of exploring the history, the language, the customs of the people of its colonies, and above all India, was I think congenial to me. So congenial that I probably would have adopted it without question. And indeed, later on, when my love affair with India took place between 1943 and 1946, I gave great attention to the works of those Englishmen, particularly in the first half of the 19th century, who had identified themselves with India, and to whom indeed we owe a great deal of our knowledge of Indian language, literature and background in and before the 19th century.
Could I ask you about the question of contact with pacifists in Britain in the late 30s? Did you have much personal contact with them, either at Cambridge or elsewhere?
I would hardly remember it because it wouldn't have got any distance. It would have been.
Accession number 10044, Reel 2.
Mr. Powell, Reel 2.
It was as somebody imbued with the vision of a British Empire, unique but potentially tough and resilient, that I retraversed the journey from Darwin to London by flying boat. It was a journey of which the stages became shorter and the timings became longer as we approached a Europe which was already at war. Though I do remember an interlude when, it having been discovered that I was Professor of Greek at the University of Sydney, the flying boat crew and the few passengers who were on the flight insisted that we stopped off an extra 3 hours in Athens so that I could take them round the Acropolis. Now it so happened that having been a grammatical rather than an archaeological scholar, I'd never been on the Greek mainland. However, the Acropolis bore a sufficient resemblance to what I knew about it from books, that I was able to acquit myself without exposing too much ignorance. So one arrived eventually, and with great joy, in a blacked out England, somewhere around, this must be somewhere around the 21st, 22nd of September 1939.
Had the atmosphere changed amongst the people?
It was an England at war. It was an England under the blackout. It was an England which hadn't yet discovered that it could live with war, and to which war was still an unknown and therefore a terrifying quantity. However, I returned to my parents' home in Seaford in Sussex, where my books and all my possessions were that I'd left behind when I went to Australia, and I set out to get myself recruited. There was a special reason for urgency in doing so. I had, in the winter of 1938-1939, been appointed Professor of Greek and Classical Literature in the University of Durham, my appointment to commence from the 1st of January 1940. And I viewed with dread the gradual approach of the 1st of January 1940, when, had I taken up that appointment, I might have found myself irretrievably non-combatant for one means or another, and combatant I was somehow determined to be. So I frequented recruiting stations with no success at all for 4 or 5 weeks. Recruitment was not taking place, and someone who hadn't even got Certificate A and who had no pre-war training was not wanted. There was, I remember, a clerkship at Chatham that was vacant, but I passed that one up. However, about the middle of October, and I forget in what circumstances, I became aware that Australia House had made an agreement with the British government, since many Australians were coming to Britain who had found their way home in order to fight in what they assumed was November 1918 going on, and were actually starving because they couldn't get into the forces. An agreement that on a person being certified, duly certified as Australian, he would as such be recruited into the British Army in the regiment of his choice. So on the 20th of October 1939, I went to Australia House, announced myself as the Professor of Greek in the University of Sydney, and claimed to be, for the purposes of the agreement with the British government, an Australian. So they used the usual Australian phrase, reckon you'll do, and I was provided with a foolscap-sized piece of paper with Australia at the top of it in large red letters, which directed any recruiting station to enlist the under-mentioned man into the regiment of his choice, forthwith. Armed with that, I did my medical examination, and I took the oath and received the shilling, though I don't remember that, but at any rate metaphorically received the shilling at Edgware recruiting station, Edgware recruiting station in Middlesex, and was on the train on the 21st of October to Warwick, where I having chosen as my regiment the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, for no other reason, I don't say no better reason, for it is a good reason, but for no other reason than that my father, when a student at Saltley College in 1890, had served in K Company of the 8th Volunteer Battalion of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment as a volunteer, and was therefore, which was my only family connection so far as I knew with the army, and was therefore a regiment to specify. It was also a regiment with recruiting connections with Birmingham, where I was born, so it wouldn't be a regiment in which I should be a stranger. So I was duly met, dressed like a professor, hat and umbrella and coat, off for train at Warwick Station by a corporal and 2 men, who I think must have imagined that I was an inspecting official from the War Office. And I think there was some disappointment when they discovered that I was enlisting as a private. And within an hour, I was converted into Private Powell, 5110-957 in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, and was on my way to my first meal in barracks.
What was that like?
It consisted of potatoes, faggots and peas. Good black country fare, good Midlands fare. On the way, I was accosted by a young soldier, who I afterwards learnt was a regular bandsman, who in fact lived in the barrack room to which I was assigned. The barrack rooms at Budbrook Barracks were all named after the battle honours of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, and it was the battle at Orthez, or as we pronounced it, or Orthez, in the Pyrenees, where Wellington defeated Soult, I think, that I found myself with straw-filled palliasse and iron bed. Anyhow, as we surged down with the mass of humanity, I was accosted by this individual who said, "Who was I?" And I told him. He said, "Can you fight?" I said, "Well, that's what I've come for. That's what I've come to learn to do." "No," said he. "I mean, can you fight with your fists?" I said, "Well, I hadn't done much of that." He said, "That's a pity. It's pretty rough here. Anyhow, I'll look after you." And we remained friends from then onwards, as long as I was at Warwick. And he certainly prevented me from falling into any traps that I might otherwise have not discerned. Though I tell this because it is my opportunity to say that I was never the witness, or never aware, as a private soldier and non-commissioned officer, of any act of bullying or brutality or physical violence. Indeed, I was looking for the word to describe the atmosphere which prevailed in the depot at Warwick, and I would say that the best word is good-humoured. I was with recruits who were the first batch of militia, which had been called up under the reluctant conscription, and they'd been called up under the Act which was passed in May 1938, I think. So they were all 10 years younger than I was. The NCOs, though not the officers, were in many cases territorials, and a good advertisement for the pre-war territorial army. I remember with affection the company sergeant, one Sergeant Lewis, whose civvy job was cleaning the lavatories at one of the motor works in Coventry, but whose life had been the territorial army, and a very good sergeant and a very good soldier he was, and a very good training sergeant. So I have to say that despite that rather daunting welcome, I never found other than the deepest satisfaction in my life as a private soldier and presently as a Lance Corporal.
Was your comrade's prediction that it was rough borne out, though, in relationships between the men?
No, I have in retrospect thought it very puzzling. Maybe he thought that I stuck out like a sore thumb, and that I might be the object of a certain amount of rough treatment. But whatever his reason was, his apprehensions were not fulfilled, though, as I say, he was frequently able to give me a useful tip when my equipment was not in absolutely the correct style.
What did you make of your comrades' attitudes towards what was going on, towards the war? Were they able to understand what was going on in terms of the phony war?
They were certainly not resentful. They were not keen to be soldiers, and they were very conscious of the civil life that they'd left behind. One of the men I was friendly with was a fireman on a railway engine. He was very much a railwayman, and his background was the railway on which he expected to spend his lifetime so far as it wasn't interrupted by the war. They were busy hanging out the washing on the Siegfried line. They were, as I say, not resentful at being called up, at being trained as soldiers, and were not irked by a discipline which I think was probably not far from the discipline of the industrial life which most of them had been living. I remember one fellow recruit, meek little chap he was. We were both sitting on the bench in front of a great fire which was kept going at one end of the barrack room, above which were the drums and some of the colours that generate the names of the peninsular battles. There was a sense in those barracks, though they no doubt only dated from the Caldwell reforms, there was a sense in those barracks that I strongly had that I had rejoined the army of a Peninsular War. It was the professional army. It was the army of a series of professional soldiers' wars. And there's a passage in Carlyle when he says, "What would we not give to meet alive one of the hypaspists of Alexander?" Well, at least I felt I had just known before it disappeared forever, the army of Wellington. Anyhow, we were sitting on this bench in front of a blazing fire, which I think must have been the only form of heating in that long barrack room. And he was burnishing his bayonet, which he did quite lovingly. And as he finished, he said to me, in a mild, reflective sort of way, "I don't want to go home till I've stuck that into a jerry." Another recollection I have is of a recruit who earned the wrath of the weapon training officer because he couldn't get out of the habit of referring to the muzzle of his gun as the nozzle, he having no doubt been much more acquainted with nozzles than with muzzles. Of my relations with my fellow privates, two things stuck in my memory. First is, and this was a lesson for life, I wanted to be a general. I wanted to end the war, so to speak, or perhaps not so to speak, riding into Berlin on a white horse. I wanted promotion. I wanted to get on. I wanted rank. I wanted authority. The lesson I learnt was that they didn't. But they were very glad if somebody was prepared to take on any degree of responsibility. That most of the privates didn't want to be colour sergeants and didn't want to be majors or colonels came as an utter astonishment to me. All my life, from a competitive school days, in a competitive school, I had assumed that all life was about competition and that everybody wanted to get on. I found myself amongst men who were quite content when markers were called for, that Private Powell was the right-hand marker. They expected Powell to be the right-hand marker. They were pleased that Powell was the right-hand marker. And when in due course Private Powell became Lance Corporal Powell, they were gratified that this was so, instead of being, as I had supposed, envious and irritable.
But did you think any less of them because they weren't ambitious?
No, I didn't think less of them. I'd learnt a lesson. I had learnt something about my fellow men. Indeed, I'd probably learnt something about myself. And the day that I became a Lance Corporal, we had already moved out of barracks to presumably our second stage of initial training. And we were encamped on the concrete in the buildings at Warwick Racecourse, where we slept on our blankets on the concrete through the cold winter of 39-40. Every morning at Reveille, a broom would be handed round, and each private would sweep the space in which his blankets had been, and his part of the barrack room, until after the broom had done the round, the barrack room would have been completely swept. I took the broom from the next man to me automatically, and it was pulled out of my hands. "You don't do that now, Mr. Powell." They call me Mr. Powell. They always call me Mr. Powell. "You don't do that now, Mr. Powell. You're a corporal." And they took my blankets and pulled them into the corporal's bunk. Now I must explain the corporal's bunk. There was, off this room in the racecourse buildings, a smaller room, a very small room, which I take to have been ticket office or the like. It was just about big enough to contain the corporal and his bed. But it was thought necessary and insisted upon by my fellows that I should be given the class distinction of at least my head being inside the corporal's bunk when my blankets were laid out for sleeping. That night I went over to the NCO's mess. I walked across to the NCO's mess in the depot, and I was greeted by the PT RSM, a very smart man indeed he was, who came up to me at once, said, "Corporal Powell, I'm glad to see you have your stripe up. I'm glad you're not going to be ordered about by us anymore." Now that sounds horribly inverted snobby, but it wasn't. It was the most natural thing in the world, and so kindly and generously meant. I suppose there must have been some sense amongst the NCOs and even amongst the officers, but I was playing that I was taking my part as a private and taking it, as indeed I had no difficulty in taking it, as a private should take it.
Were you a smart soldier?
Sergeant Lewis told the CO that I was the smartest man in the company, which I regard as one of the highest distinctions that I've ever received. The NCO certainly wanted me to get on. The platoon corporal was particularly anxious that I shouldn't lose any points, and I remember him one day running after me when I went on to parades, saying, Mr. Powell, the knob of your boat is up," which corporals don't, it is not terms in which corporals generally address privates who are going improperly accoutred on parade. And the weapon training sergeant was very anxious that my shooting should be better than it was, and it certainly was rotten. He mistakenly thinking that my shooting would be one of the accomplishments which would count for me in being commissioned or in subsequent advancement, that being his own horizon. And he allowed me and encouraged me to use his bunk, because he had his own bunk at the end of the armory, and go in there and read field service manuals and manuals on weapons. And he gave me extra time on the range to improve shooting, which always remained awful. And I remember one day I was there, and he and the weapon training officer, Second Lieutenant Salmon, came in. And so I explained what I was doing there, which caused no objection. And I fell into conversation with the weapon training officer, who said, "I wonder where you will end the war." And I said, "I shall end the war as a Major General, sir." He didn't dispute it, but he must have thought it rather strange in 1939.
Could I ask you about the phony war and what your own attitude and that of your comrades in the barrack room was towards this so-called dead period?
I think the assumption was that it would sooner or later be 1918 all over again, that we must not be deceived or misled by the quiescence, that what we were in for was 1918. I don't remember anyone saying, or the attitude being abroad, well, this is phony anyhow and we shall soon be home again. This show isn't genuine. the show was regarded as totally genuine. If there was a delay before returning to November 1918, well then so much the better trained one would be.
Was there any sense of shame or an opportunity lost when an attack wasn't launched in the West when the Germans were attacking Poland?
I can only answer that question for myself, because I don't believe that my fellow soldiers thought much about the war in those strategic terms. My own view was that self-evidently the treaty with Poland was made in order to ensure that willy-nilly a further military adventure by Germany on the continent would bring us into the war, and that it had served its purpose, and that no one could rationally have supposed that it was in our power to prevent the overrunning of Poland, the partition of Poland by Germany and Russia. So therefore, as one naturally deplored the overwhelming of a people resisting their overweening enemies, I regarded it as an expendable trigger by which the thing so long desired that Britain decided to fight was released.
So can we pick up the story of your progress as a corporal now?
I didn't progress much as a corporal, because not long after I had my Lance Corporal stripe, I was nominated for OCTU at Aldershot. I had previously declined an offer to be trained at Minley in the Provo Corps, the Military Police Corps, and I had declined, I think, one other offer of training which didn't seem to me to lead to a combatant war. But I was content to go to be sent to an infantry OCTU at Aldershot and to be trained as an infantry officer, which I envisaged myself being, though no doubt the hand which plucked me from Warwick Barracks, plucked Corporal Powell from Warwick Barracks and converted him into Cadet Powell at Ramillies Barracks, Aldershot, was actuated with a mind that knew my command of German and of a number of other European languages. And on arriving at Aldershot in January 1940, I found that the extraordinary the extraordinary decision had been taken to put in the same platoon all those in that month who had been selected or noted as having linguistic capabilities. And a curious assortment we were, though we of immense variety from all walks of life, and with a total hatred of Germany in that barrack room, which probably couldn't have been found in a similar space anywhere else in few places elsewhere in the United Kingdom. We used to have a game after lights out, whereby someone would produce a word and we would see how many languages we could translate it into. There was Arabic, Greek, Norwegian. That resulted in one of the cadets having accelerated commissioning in April 1940. German, French, Italian, of course, and an assortment of other European languages. And we were upon the whole men who had known the continent, had known the background to Germany. There were a couple of Jews amongst us who had known what Germany was about, what Germany meant and stood for.
English Jews?
English Jews, yes. Well, I mean British Jews. One was an actor in private life. I don't know what was the profession in private life of the other. But certainly no one in that barrack room had any delusions about Germany. though many of us were fluent speakers of German and well versed in German literature and in German culture. My next door cadet, the cadet whose bunk was next to mine in the barrack room, was Hardy Ames, the dress designer, and we've remained friends ever since. He, I suppose one shouldn't tell this sort of a story, but he believed that in order to sleep well, one needed to read a French novel before turning in. So he fitted himself up with a little shelf and a candle so that he could read his French novel for 5 or 10 minutes before going to sleep. And I remember the platoon sergeant, who was one Sergeant Finney, an Irishman with a high-pitched voice, entering the barrack room to find Cadet Ames reading his novel with his candle. And he lifted up in his voice and said, "You gentlemen are not being fair to me. I don't mind you gentlemen having a candle to undress by, but to use a candle to read by, you're not being unfair to me." The candle was put out. My recollection of being a cadet is very different from my recollection of being a private soldier or a lance corporal. As a private soldier and a lance corporal, you knew what you were. But an officer cadet is neither one thing nor the other. He's going to be an officer, but he isn't. He no longer is a private soldier and isn't. And this twilight existence, I think, was very irksome to those, though it was only 4 months out of our lives, who awaited commissioning with great impatience, and who found, though it was not unreasonable, the discipline of the Aldershot unit irksome in a way that the discipline of the infantry barrack had not been. I think one of the factors in this was that we were very conscious that most of the officers knew no more about war than we did. There was a great contrast between the officers who had been in the First War and those who had not. In 164 OCTU there were only 2 officers to my knowledge. Certainly I was only concerned with 2 such officers. One was the company commander, Major Foster of the Queen's Regiment, and the other was the Colonel Bingham, the commanding officer of the unit. And there was an extraordinary difference between one's whole relationship and what one learnt from those men and one's relationship with the other instructors.
Accession number 10044, Reel 3.
Mr. Powell, Reel 3.
I remember one day on exercise that we were staging an attack on a position, and we were being watched by the company commander, Major Foster, and he had us up in front of him afterwards and said, "That was very good indeed. I was very pleased with you. That was a very good show indeed. I particularly liked the way in which the flank attack came in from the left. Mind you, of course, you would all have been wiped out. You do understand that, don't you? Not one of you would have reached the position that you are attacking." It was that kind of reminder of reality which so few of the officers to whose care we were committed were able to exhibit. And I think we found irksome the exercise of discipline and authority by those who had neither the advantage of experience nor that of education beyond our own.
Had you had any contact at all with professional soldiers before all this?
My only background was that in the 1920s and 30s, that is to say, at the end of my school days and as a student and later, I had been an avid reader of literature on the First World War. I had a whole shelf full of books on the First World War, and I'd been very impressed, and this had been strengthened by anecdotal information, by the manner in which a hard and fast line had been maintained in the First World War between the regulars, particularly regular officers, whose profession it remained and would continue to be, and those who were brought in for the war, who were called, so I understood, temporary gentlemen. One of the big lessons to me, one of the big observations, and I think if this had not been so, we might not have won, was that we started the Second War in this respect quite differently from the way we ended the First, with regular forces who knew and expected that they would need to cope and to use millions of untrained essential civilians. The attitude of the regular forces towards the civilian was totally different from that which one had been led to expect from the literature of the First World War, and indeed from what I believe it actually was in the First World War. I look back with astonishment upon periods in my service during which I must have appeared to regular officers a most intractable, insubordinate and unhelpful officer. And I cannot but marvel at the patience and understanding with which I and many others like me were handled. And I'm sure this was because they entered the war saying to themselves, these may be pretty queer characters, but we shan't win the war without them. We've got to use them. There's no point in falling out with them. They've come here to fight. We'll use them. And we'll use them for what they're worth. That was perhaps less evident at Aldershot than almost anywhere, but at Aldershot was a training machine for producing traditional type officers. And I suppose that was one of the reasons why that was not the happiest period. Anyhow, it came to an end, and in May 1940, 6 of us, or was it more than 6, got into one taxi, and I was pushed in last, face foremost, to the cry from outside, the professors being launched starn first, having been commissioned and going off to our life as officers.
Just before we take it further, if I could go back to your interest in the First World War, can you recollect any of the books that you read which made a big impact on you?
The biggest impression was made by Liddell Hart's book, The Real War, is it not?
I think so, yeah.
Yes. And many years later, when I was shadow defense spokesman of the Conservative Party in the 1960s, I was to seek out Liddell Hart, for whom I'd always retained a great intellectual admiration, and visit him at his home at Medmenham. I remember his wife, who greeted me, was surprised to see that I had walked up the hill. I replied to her, when you visit a sage, you should always walk up the hill to meet him. I suppose it was Liddell Hart's interpretation of the war, of armoured warfare, of the rigidity of military thinking that conditioned my attitude to the army before and in the initial stages of my service.
Was it the strategy of the First World War that particularly interested you, or other aspects as well?
I was interested in war as war, one of the great activities of mankind, irresistibly fascinating to a student of man. On my first leave, my first weekend leave as a private, I went to Cambridge and bought Clausewitz in German, in Dighton Bells in Trinity Street, Cambridge, and read it through without being able to put it down. I stayed up night after night, unable to stop reading Clausewitz. It's one of the books which have most gripped my mind as a powerful work of philosophy. So I must have been interested in war as war, and I was naturally interested in war as a means of victory, and interested in the potential relevance of the experience of 1914 to 1918 to what was going on after 1939. I was an eager soldier, not merely a willing soldier, but an eager soldier, and alas, perhaps an intellectual soldier. But then I couldn't help that, could I? Anyhow, once commissioned, it was courses. One was not posted to a regiment, one was on courses. Perhaps that was because of one's supposed endowments, linguistic and other endowments. And the first course was a course in field security at Sheerness, during the course of which the evacuation from Dunkirk was taking place. And it was there that one of the instructors was a man whom I've had subsequent contacts with, namely Malcolm Muggeridge, who was deposed that at that time I still wore my moustache in its Nietzschean soup strainer guise, though I have also claimed that one of the sacrifices which I laid upon the altar of my country was to clip my moustache, and certainly it can't have been much later than that I clipped it once and for all and deserted the soup strainer fashion. I wasn't particularly interested in field security, but I was intensely interested in the next course, which, for the shades of a prison house were closing in upon me, was a course in interrogation, originally to have been held at Thorpe Ness, but hastily transferred from Thorpe Ness to Swanage, as being rather further away from where the enemy had got to. That was a marvellous treat. We were a small course, not more than 10 or 11, all German specialists, and training in the decipherment of and study of German documents, the reading of Deutsche Schrift as written by uneducated Germans, and study of the organization of a German army, the German mentality, and given the basic equipment which an interrogator would need.
Can you tell me what you learnt about interrogation techniques?
One learnt the importance of appearing to know more than the prisoner. You had to be familiar with, not merely with the German army, but with that part of a German army to which he belonged, with the habits of a German army, the thought of a German army, the documentation of a German army, so that he would find himself in a familiar environment and therefore be prone to add the missing pieces to the jigsaw, the pieces that one didn't have. And one was taught to sing the Nazi war songs. Wir fahren gegen England. I can still sing the song of a German navy. Wir fahren gegen England.
Were you taught anything in the interrogation techniques about cruel and kind alternating?
I think that would probably have been imparted at a later stage when we were actually working at a cage. But I never did work at a cage because, still anxious to avoid non-combatant entanglement, I got myself transferred to the military intelligence course, which was a large course which ran simultaneously at Swansea. And from that I qualified... Swanage, I'm sorry. From that I must have qualified in September. In August 1940. And I was posted as intelligence officer to 1st Armoured Division after a brief spell as intelligence officer of an infantry brigade which was on counter-invasion duties in the Bisley area.
Could I just ask you a few questions here about the situation the country found itself in June 1940? From what you saw of the attitudes of people, did you get the feeling that people were aware immediately after Dunkirk of the peril the country was in? Or do you think there was any complacency?
My impression is that Churchill was aiming exactly right, that he was talking to those who were predisposed to see the situation as he was presenting it to them, a situation where one at least had the advantage of having clarified the nature of the danger, having almost maximized the nature of the danger, and yet of a degree of confidence that one would survive it. Though I do remember in August, it must have been in August, that a fellow officer and I who were on the intelligence course both decided that if the King Emperor made peace, we would shoot ourselves with our service revolvers. That was the correct course of action to take in the event that instead of, for instance, moving to Canada and continuing the war from there, if the King had been party to a surrender, I remember deciding, one cannot decide whether one would have carried it out, and one can never know, but one's frame of mind was that in those circumstances an officer had no justification for going on living.
Did you come across other officers who had the attitude, well, if the government gives in, we'll go into the hills and conduct guerrilla warfare?
I can't remember that being discussed. I suppose it is surprising in retrospect that one remembers so little of discussions in which disagreeable scenarios and doubts and difficulties would be ventilated. At least I don't come to such an occasion until later, when I arrive at the Great Fire of Cairo in the summer of 1942, when I do remember having a knapsack packed and deciding with a brother officer that we would make our way, we would get out of Egypt through Palestine and make our way across into India and, if possible, China, which seemed to us the only remaining bastion, if the Middle East fell, from which the war against Japan and Germany could be continued. But the very fact that episode is so far on seems to indicate that doubts as to one's own course of action, as to the course of action of one's fellow officers and one's men in catastrophe, cannot have been a widespread subject of conversation or discussion. It's a question which I'm dismayed never to have asked myself or been asked before. It shows to me that you become habituated, as it were, to war as a way of life. It is a sustaining medium which will manage to go on somehow and won't let you down. And in this medium, you swim, not interrogating the war any more than you interrogate the water when you swim in water. That's the nearest metaphor that I can achieve to what I admit in retrospect appears to be a singularly uncritical and unquestioning frame of mind. Well,
before you go on, could I just ask you again about this period? Because reading recently Montgomery's memoirs of this period, he was very critical in those memoirs about the fact that, as he said, the British public treated the returning BEF men from Dunkirk as heroes. Did you see anything of that yourself?
Maybe Montgomery was wrong and the British public were right. Maybe behind the reception of those who'd come back without the heavy equipment from France, there was an instinct, and a true instinct, that the ultimate defence and prospect, if there was one, of victory, was for an insular Britain. The recovery of our insularity was something which I believe the British understood in the summer of 1940, and I believe it was their morale was assisted by the sense of regained insularity. This is a dangerous rumination for me to engage in, because 47 years after, one is certain to have fed into the recollection all kinds of material which have only grown in one's mind or been distilled from experience much later. But that, at any rate, is how I now see the kind of cheerful acceptance which was so much the prevalent mood in the summer of 1940.
You mean it was a sense of the public that things had become less complicated?
They become more manageable, yes. They become more manageable, more real, more winnable even. There was a sense of self-reliance and upon the natural strengths of one's position and national character being brought into play. I suppose I was not less aware of this because my first substantive posting was as intelligence officer to 1st Armoured Division, which was stationed in Surrey, near Dorking, as one of the 2 divisions in Canadian Corps at Headley, and was part of the counter-attack force in the event of invasion. I was only a month with the 1st Armoured Division, but I drew from that experience 2 attachments. One was to armoured units, and another was to the cavalry officers as a corps within the corps of the regular officers of the army. The strong contrast between the Royal Tank Regiment officers and the cavalry officers, and the high intellectual capacity of those officers who at the outbreak of war were of the grade of GSO2 and GSO1, having been through Staff College, impressed me greatly. And when linked with the panache of the cavalrymen who joined cavalry regiments because they had the money to do so in the 1930s, it was a very potent and impressive combination. And certainly the men that I served under, who were senior staff officers in the 1st Armoured Division, impressed me deeply, and I didn't revise that impression later in the war, where I found your Staff College trained cavalryman was one of the best people alongside whom one could deal with the intellectual problems of wartime management, of the management of an army in war.
Could I ask again at this point another general question related to this, related to the whole question of Britain's military strength in relation to Germany? You've explained how you had relatively little contact with army people before the war. When you first went into the army, were you impressed or not with Britain's military strength and preparedness and ability to meet the German threat?
Well, I was certainly not impressed with our preparedness in global terms. Indeed, that had been the burden of my anxiety and disgust during the 1930s. But that was in no way reflected upon the quality or motivation of the men whom I encountered, either as NCOs or as officers. Indeed, in 1st Armoured Division, one was meeting people who, in one sense, were the pick of Armoured Division officers, who had devoted thought to the role of armoured formations, and from whom, by a process of throwing off cadres, most of the other armoured divisions were created. I remember there was one point at which I was likely to be posted to the new 6th Armoured Division. And the G3 of the 6th Armoured Division came to interview me to see if I'd do. And he asked me one question: do you like oysters? Which I answered in the affirmative. He said, well, then we shall get on splendidly. But it wasn't to the 6th Armoured Division that I was posted. It was to the completely new 9th Armoured Division. And I was one of the first 5 officers of that division. But I see that I have kangarooed an incident which occurred during the Battle of Britain period, which I think helps to account for my conviction at that time that there would not be an invasion. I remember standing in the headquarters of the 1st Armoured Division with His Royal Highness the Duke of Gloucester, Major General, in front of my barge map, the map of a channel on which I had carefully marked up the concentrations of barges which were duly reported by the air reconnaissance, though other sources of information were a closed secret to me still at that time. And I remember saying to His Royal Highness, they won't invade. He rejoined, oh yes, they will, they're going to invade. And I must admit that the following morning, about 4 a.m., when I heard the waves of aircraft coming over, suddenly there seized me, as it had never done before or after, the vision of one's country invaded and occupied and defeated. But they didn't. And the reason why I was sure they wouldn't was not because of the formidable preparations in which the 1st Armoured Division and other forces, well under strength and equipment, were engaged in Sussex and Kent, nor, I'm sorry to say, was it faith in the efficacy of the Royal Air Force. It was the belief that ultimately the Royal Navy would be successful in preventing any major establishment or reinforcement of a German army on English soil, that the expenditure of a considerable number of ships, irreplaceable troops and forces would be destroyed if they attempted the perilous passage of the English Channel. Of course, this is one of those might-have-beens that one can never cross-check. I'm merely deposing that I regarded the Royal Navy, rather than the Royal Air Force, as the key factor which, if properly appraised, would deter Germany from the attempt to invade this country. No doubt the prevention of the air preparation to which they'd been accustomed on the continent was an important factor. But I still believe that in the last resort, had they tried it on, they would have failed, not because of anything which happened to them after landing, but because the passage and the reinforcement of those who had passed simply could not have been maintained in the face of the self-sacrifice of the Royal Navy, which would have been evoked at that stage.
Was there any kind of historical consciousness on your part that this was 1588 or the 1790s, that kind of historical crisis that you were living through?
I think that was only reflected in this idealization, for such I suppose it is, of the function of a Royal Navy and the command of a sea in relation to the defence of the United Kingdom. That had always been at the centre of my perceptions, the sovereign importance of naval command of the sea. And it was probably upon that I rested my conviction that a successful invasion, even in the circumstances of October 1940, was not on the cards. I was sorry to leave 1st Armoured Division because the corps d'esprit de corps in that outfit was very strong indeed, and I'd learnt a great deal, and I'd been thoroughly socialised into an armoured formation. So I was happy to find myself on the ground floor in the formation of 9th Armoured Division. There were 5 of us officers who reported first at Guilsborough Hall in Northamptonshire, and there was one chair in the entire building. On that was seated the senior officer who was a major, and from that base, the division gradually built up. I was G3 of that armoured division, GSO 3. Curiously enough, an armoured division did not have an establishment for a separate GSO 3 intelligence. I therefore claimed that I was the General Staff Officer.
Accession number 10044, reel 4.
Mr. Powell, reel 4.
There was, of course, a General Staff Officer Grade 3 for chemical warfare, and it's a significant fact that at that stage in the war there was such a separate appointment in the establishment of the headquarters of an armoured division. However, in effect, I found myself doing general staff work, the equipment of units, the delivery of tanks to units, the equipment of units, the drawing up of exercises, the execution of exercises, all that general staff work, though I was at a low level, did come my way. And I found that I learnt a great deal about staff work and about the inbuilt efficiency of the Army's methods, which I was obliged gradually to acquire in the 6 months that I was with the headquarters of 9th Armoured Division. I also, which was to be relevant later, made many friends in the cavalry regiments which were in the 9th Armoured Division. And when subsequently I got myself transferred out of the general list, which I never wanted to belong to, who would? My first attempt was to get into the 5th Royal Inniskilling Dragoon Guards, as I'd known them, in 9th Armoured Division. In the end, I settled for the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, and very happily ever afterwards. But it was 6 months of intensive training in an aspect of military organisation which was quite strange to me, and from which I learnt quickly and deeply. It was from there that, thanks to the General putting my name forward, I was posted to the 5th War Course at Camberley, the 5th War Staff Course at Camberley. And I certainly owe a great deal to the General Officer for having given me that opportunity at that stage in my service. The bombing of Coventry took place a few miles away from 9th Armoured Division, and the interruption of the manufacture of war material, and particularly of armoured vehicles, was very noticeable. The formation of a division was certainly held up quite substantially by the destruction brought about in the bombing of Coventry. I remember the glow in the sky just over the horizon from Northamptonshire. I was also in the headquarters of that armoured division, seeing something close by of the ordinary work of a regimental officer. And I remember a strange episode in which a trooper in the headquarters unit had been accused of theft and asked that I should defend him at court-martial. And to this day, I'm puzzled why I failed to get him off. He evidently thought that as I'd been a professor and had some reputation for intellectual capability, that I would be a good advocate. But I imagine that probably the officers knew what they were doing, and that I was firing into the void. That's one little experience that remains with me from those months with 9th Armoured Division. The Staff College I regard still as the most valuable 4 months training and education I ever had in my life. It disappointed me initially when I discovered that it was primarily to be concerned with staff duties at brigade and divisional level. For saturated with Clausewitz and the art of war, I had imagined that it's at Staff College at last the movements of armies and army groups would be among the subjects which we should study. There were two French officers on the same course who had escaped at the fall of France, with one of whom I remained close friend until he died a few years ago. And we did have the sort of conversation at Camberley that I had imagined one would have at a military staff college. So we were derisively described as the strategists.
Can you remember his name?
De Gauguin was the name of a man with whom I remained friendly. He was from La Rochelle and was of a Huguenot family. De Vaugoin, D-V-A-U-G-O-I-N. De Vaugoin. However, the staff work at brigade and divisional level, as it was taught at the Staff College, certainly gave me rules of conduct in the dispatch of business and habits of precision and exactitude, which I have used for the rest of my life and for which I've always been grateful. The proposition that everything must always be described in the same way, that a description must be unambiguous, that a message must be capable of containing all the necessary information and nothing else, and of being understood under conditions of great haste and distress. All these lessons were inculcated successfully by the 4-month staff course at Camberley. I also learnt to appreciate the instructive value of Vatute, tactical exercise with our troops, which we also construed as a tedious exercise without termination. The extent to which officers could be trained and military thinking could be stimulated by moving around the country with maps and imaginary armies was, of course, pioneered by the German General Staff Corps on their Generalstabsritt, as they used to call it. But it was certainly a most effective method of concentrating the mind in a manner which on ordinary exercises, conventional exercises, would have been impossible, on the type of decision and the predicament with which staff officers would have to cope. And I've no hesitation, taking it all, in giving high commendation to the quality of the instruction with which I was turned out with an SC, subsequently in egalitarian days commuted to a PSC, with the removal of the dagger which had originally indicated that it was only war service. On passing out, and that does not signify passing out in a peacetime sense, from that staff course, I had hoped that I would be posted to an armoured division again. And I went to and beyond the limits of insubordination in the endeavour to attain that objective, when I learnt that I was to be sent out to the headquarters Middle East in an intelligence staff job, to my disgust, and what's more, sent out in the rank of captain instead of major, as which would be the rank to which most of my fellow students would, most of my fellow students would be reappointed. However, to Cairo I was posted in October 1941, after arriving immediately after the failure of Operation Crusader and the stabilization of the opposing forces at Hal Fire. I had my closest lifelong friend, who was before the war a traffic apprentice with the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, had before the war joined the supplementary reserve of officers as a transportation and railway expert, and was as such commissioned in the Royal Engineers and called up before the actual outbreak of war. We never met again until I was with 9th Armoured Division, and then resumed our usual relationship. But he disappeared from my ken in the summer of 1941. When I landed by flying boat on the Nile on my arrival in Egypt, he met me at the landing stage, having noticed my name in the list of passengers and thinking it part of his duty as staff captain transportation to confirm my arrival. My arrival perhaps needed confirmation. A number of officers were sent out to the Middle East in October by an extraordinary route. We were flown to Shannon. From Shannon we were flown to Lisbon. From Lisbon we were flown to Malta. And on from Malta to Alexandria, to Cairo. So I was with the familiar Imperial Airways flying boats again, in their wartime guise. But since we were going through neutral countries, we were sent out as civilians, and each of us was provided with a civilian passport for the purpose, though our uniforms were carefully packed in our suitcases. At Shannon, we went through an interrogation, by the immigration officer, customs officer, no doubt, who, rather to my discomfiture, said, "I see you're a civil servant. What department are you in?" Now, I hadn't thought that one out. He saw my hesitation. He said, "I mean, are you in the Treasury?" So I said, "Yes, I'm in the Treasury, of course." He said, "Like Mr. So-and-so who's just gone through?" I said, "Yes, we're travelling out together." So I immediately, after emerging, buttonholed this individual and said, "Look, I gather you told them you're in the Treasury. I said I'm with you and that I'm in the Treasury too. I thought you better know, so we'll stick to the same story, shall we? So he said, but I am in the Treasury. I said, now look, you don't need to do that. We're all officers here. What regiment are you in? I'm Royal Warwick. This gentleman here is in the Royal Navy. He said, but I am in the Treasury. And for a long time he was unable to convince us that he really was a civil servant. He was quite indignant about it. The other incidents I remember in that transit were being in a hotel in Lisbon with Germans at the next table in a brightly illuminated Lisbon. And the final event was in taking off from beleaguered Malta. The flying boats had a limited tolerance of wave height, and we took a chance in taking off. And when we turned back, the captain observed that one more of those and we would have been stove in. So it perhaps wasn't entirely superfluous for my friend Captain Curtis, Staff Officer Transport, to make it part of his duty to greet me on my arrival in Cairo. I found that I was to work with a Colonel C.M. Keeble, who afterwards became known to history for his part in the affairs of Yugoslavia, in 1944-1945. Lieutenant Colonel C.M. Keeble, Wiltshire Regiment. He had been an instructor on the intelligence course at Swanage a year before and had apparently asked for me to be posted out to his section. I should have mentioned that when on the intelligence course in Swanage, I wrote an appreciation and offered it to my superior officers. It was an appreciation in which I argued, I thought convincingly, that we could only win the war if Russia came in, that only Russia could provide the continental manpower and the continental pressure which would make it possible for Germany to be defeated. And I understood afterwards that considerable inquiries had been made as to my political background to discover how an officer can have such extraordinary ideas about the essential function of Russia in August 1940, a time when certainly Russia seemed a long way off. I'm not sure that exactly was what commended me to Colonel Keeble. Anyhow, I was given my assignment. I was to familiarize myself with the transport organization of the German army in the Middle East, and also with the movement capabilities of the German army in various circumstances, such as an attempt to enter the Middle East from the north, through Turkey or through Persia. Because by now, the invasion of Russia occurred while I was still at Staff College. In June, did it not? 1941.
Yes.
I remember I was visiting a young cavalryman whom I had met on these intelligence courses and who had become intelligence officer to 9th Armoured Division. And we kept in touch. And he was in the military hospital for something in Hatfield House. Now, I remember on my previous visit to see him, on the 16th, which was my birthday, he had given me the works of Pushkin in Russian. And then on the 23rd, my next visit a week later, we were confronted with the fact of the invasion of Russia and the provision of that factor in a British victory by which I had been dominated from the outset in 1939.
So you must have been delighted then when you heard that Hitler had invaded Russia.
It was like coming out of darkness into light.
But how did you react when, in the early months, Russia looked as though she was defeated?
Well, 1812 I suppose, is as firmly lodged, almost as firmly lodged as 1588 in the folk memory of the English. And I suppose that just as we have thought in 1940, that when the British stage a major retreat and leave the continent, they are laying the foundations of victory. I suppose one supposed that the Russians always got themselves thoroughly defeated and withdrew into the heart of Russia as a preliminary to inflicting an irreversible reverse upon the dominant power on the European continent. So I cannot remember registering dismay, though I was very much aware of Stalingrad in the winter of 42-43. So I set to work with the intelligence material with which I was provided, and I made myself acquainted with the logistics of moving armoured divisions from the Bulgarian frontier to Syria, and also with the logistics of movement in Iraq and Persia. I considered at that stage that my duty to the war effort was to manipulate the German capability. Now, in any calculation of movement capabilities for a large armed forces, there is a huge latitude for the variables which enter into the calculation, particularly where so little of the railway system has been surveyed for military purposes, as had the Turkish railway system. And according to the assumptions which one makes, one can arrive at striking the different capabilities of movement and arrival at a point. The worse the campaign went in North Africa, with which I was not directly concerned, except that I examined a good deal of German captured material bearing upon the supply position. The worse the battle went in North Africa, the more slowly the German High Command would have succeeded in penetrating Turkey. One's heart would have bled for the difficulties which the Germans would have encountered in invading Turkey and opening a second front in the Middle East. As things got better, however, the prospects which I produced for the German movements correspondingly improved, and their arrival dates and their number of divisions on a line at a given D+ date improved substantially, which even shows how in a humble position, low down in an intelligence organization, there is an input which can affect the morale of the High Command, or at any rate which was intended to affect the morale of the High Command. My view being that I don't want the High Command distracted from the main effort in North Africa, so I'll do my little bit to ensure that they're not distracted. I'm sure this is a confession which an intelligence officer ought not to be making. So I'll proceed to my next confession, which is more cheerful. There came a time when I had gained the confidence of senior officers sufficiently by my work in this unit, which as a cover was called MI Plans, to be brought into use, into direct use of the ultra material which lay behind so many of the bogus intelligence reports, of the intelligence reports credited to espionage, which had previously come across my desk. And I remember very vividly the day when I was introduced to Uncle Henry. For Uncle Henry was the pet name by which Ultra went in the Middle East amongst those who were on the list for using it. It derives from a passage in Jerome K. Jerome where the phrase occurs, "You should always believe what your Uncle Henry tells you." And we nearly always did believe what our Uncle Henry told us. And he told us, of course, as everyone nowadays knows, the most significant and important things. In particular, he told us facts which enabled the German supply position in North Africa to be calculated probably more accurately than it was known to Rommel himself, or certainly as accurately as it was known. The cargoes, the places of arrival, the capacity of the ships, the ammunition state, the transportation difficulties, these became part of a picture which I was still theoretically only concerned with outside the field in North Africa. However, I was seeing the material. And in January 1942, advice was tendered to the Commander-in-Chief by the Director of Military Intelligence that German Mark II tanks were the heaviest armour likely to be encountered, and that 5th Light, which had become 5th Armoured and was Rommel's main armoured unit, was not equipped with armour above Mark II. Now this information, which one should never say caused, but was a contributory cause to the underestimate, which was so dangerous and nearly fatal in North Africa, of German armoured capabilities, actually arose in the room where I worked, because Long Range Desert Group, with whom I was subsequently to spend a few weeks carrying out a reconnaissance of the Katara Depression to determine whether a flanking move could be carried out by German armour through the Katara Depression so as to turn the line at El Alamein. That remarkable outfit, Long Range Desert Group, had maintained a dawn to dusk visual survey of the North Africa Road east of El Agheila, and had reported back the numbers and types of all vehicles passing in both directions. They maintained this watch from a position which incredibly was never observed, not much more than 100 yards away from the road, where they lay up after having arrived by crawling, protected by undulations in the desert. And they lay up for hours just counting and eventually being relieved and reporting back. They described vehicles which appeared to be German tanks Mark III and Mark IV. But the possibility that Mark IV tanks could be moving, I said east when I meant west of El Agheila, that German Mark IV tanks could be moving east in North Africa was discounted because there were known to be no derricks at Tripoli which could handle the weight of Mark IV tanks, nor could ships' derricks handle Mark IV tanks. The report was therefore discounted, and the build-up of heavy armour in Rommel's force in the early months, the early weeks of 1941 was
1942.
Was written down by the intelligence advice to the High Command and to 8th Army. There was a gap in the reasoning. The reasoning was faulty because it composed information of different qualities. It combined information we had information of high quality from Ultra, which certainly did not specify cargoes comprising Mark III and Mark IV tanks. We had information visually, but subject to the qualifications of visual information, from the long-range desert group. And we had knowledge, which was of a different quality, of the capability of the available cranes or derricks. Now it so happened that in the 1930s, in order to facilitate the export of very heavy locomotives to South America, Germany had built two ships, the Leverkusen and the Ankara, which were capable of handling loads of 900 tons with their derricks. Those ships had been moved to the Mediterranean. The Leverkusen was sunk at an early stage, but the Ankara had a kind of charmed life. And the Ankara was carrying Marks III and IV tanks into Tripoli.
Accession number 10044, reel 5.
Mr. Powell, reel 5.
I realized after the loss of Cyrenaica that a grave error had been made, a grave intellectual error had been made in the room where I was working. And from that moment onwards, though it was not interpretation of the ultra material that had been at fault, I duplicated the whole of the work on the North African ports and campaign. I digested the entire ultra material, as well as the entire photographic reconnaissance material, and understudied, therefore, in that sense of understudied, the work which my superior officer was doing. And I relate this as an illustration of what I said at an earlier stage about the regular army in the Second World War. For it must have been somewhere in April, March perhaps, 1942, that I walked into the colonel's room and dropped into his in-tray a photo reconnaissance survey in which I had identified all the vessels, described only in the survey report, of course, by their length and position. It wasn't wrong before the bell rang. "I think you have this one wrong," said the colonel. So I argued my case and satisfied him that I had in fact correctly identified that ship too. "All the others are right," said he. "From now onwards, you will take over this work." Now I think there's real greatness and real credit is due to an officer in those circumstances who realized what had been going on and then at that point said, "Well, all right, you take it over." And at that point, from that point onwards, I became the army member of an inter-service body at Lieutenant Colonel Commander level. I was by then a major and was shortly afterwards promoted Lieutenant Colonel, which, on the basis of ultra and other material and appreciations, largely produced by the Army, offered targeting advice to the Navy and to the RAF, and the manner in which the celebrated 3 albacores and the swordfish operating from Malta were utilized to do far more destruction of enemy shipping than they should have accounted for, emanated from the discussions which took place before dawn in that inter-service committee. That was therefore the intensive work in which I found myself involved heart and soul. I was given an RAF lieutenant, flight lieutenant as a number 2, in the spring of 1942. That was my work while the army was falling back to El Alamein. And at this stage, I was directly in contact with the DMI who had succeeded Shearer, namely de Gangon. And I was working to de Gangon direct in the appreciations which he was supplying to 8th Army and the General and the GOC as the situation deteriorated in North Africa. I remember the day when Mercer Matruh fell. I was actually in the room with him when the news came in that Mercer Matruh fell. I reckon, said he, there'll be rioting in the streets of Cairo tonight. There wasn't. The position held, the morale held in Egypt to an extent which certainly surprised those who were certainly surprised the military command in Middle East.
Could I ask you about what you observed of the attitude of the Egyptian population towards the British presence?
I did not, in the course of my duty, have occasion for direct relations with the Egyptian population or with their leading personalities. But I must say that I was surprised by the expectation that there would be trouble at that stage in Cairo. Certainly there was a degree of sullenness, and I think no one made the mistake of assuming that had the Germans taken over Egypt, the Egyptians would have staged a resistance movement against them. However, there undoubtedly was a marked contrast, which was based in history, between the relationship of the army in Egypt with the Egyptians and the relationship of the British in India with the population of that country. It is, as I say, based in history. England, after all, was always a temporarily occupying power in Egypt, and considerable bitterness and difficulty had attended the acceptance in the 1930s of Egyptian independence. It was perfectly visible to the naked eye, but as long as Britain needed Egypt and the Suez Canal for defence purposes, that independence would be severely qualified to an extent which was bound to be irksome to nationalists. In India, on the other hand, the presence of the British and the collaboration of the population in the formation and maintenance of the army was of long standing and was part of the fabric of the country. Almost appeared one of the inevitabilities of nature. Jumping ahead to my days in India, I remember being constantly struck with the apparent inevitability which appeared to attach to the British rule and to the British presence. An Englishman, even in areas where the British were rarely seen, had rarely occasion to be seen, was treated, when he entered a village, more as a phenomenon of nature. As it were, that is the moon rising, that is the Englishman walking through the village, rather than as the intrusion of something which did not belong to the scene. On one occasion, I remember I was travelling by myself in North Bihar, and suddenly it occurred to me that I must be the only Englishman, indeed the only European, amongst several millions of a population in all directions, and yet my presence there seemed to be as accepted as it would have been if I had been travelling from London to Birmingham in my own country. So that although the end of British rule in India was, historically speaking, close in 1943, 1944, and 1945, the sense of an imminent revolution was certainly absent from relations between the ordinary Englishman and the ordinary population.
What would be the reaction of Egyptians as you walked through their towns and villages?
I don't think it would have the same implication that after all the Englishman is part of Egypt. The British were part of British India. They were not something strange, they were not something artificial, they were not something which a conjuncture of political events like those in Egypt in the 1870s and 1880s had imposed. There was therefore a degree of acceptance and a kind of acceptance of a British and of a British army in India, which you could not expect to find in Egypt.
Did you ever personally come across hostility from Egyptians?
No, I can't say that I did. I think the word sullenness represents about the worst that one encountered, but one was conscious of a degree of jealousy regarding the presence of the British in India, particularly amongst officials who would be naturally the people who would be in a position to feel and to exhibit it.
Presence in Egypt?
Yes. Well, it was shortly after the taking of Mersa Matruh, and as a direct consequence, that there occurred the event which was jocularly described as the Great Fire of Cairo, when all the offices in the headquarters in Cairo were exhorted to destroy their papers as far as those could be dispensed with, on the assumption that they might imminently be falling into the hands of the enemy. The sky was dark with the smoke of the fires burning in the various courtyards, and dust fell heavily, rather like the dust on Pompeii, upon the houses and the streets beneath. This gave, I must say, a reality to the expectation of imminent German occupation, which it had hitherto lacked. And I remember that a brother officer of mine, a man who was my lifelong friend, who was in transportation at General Headquarters Cairo, and I formed a decision as to what we personally would do in the event of total collapse. And I do recall that we had our knapsacks packed with what we regarded as necessary to get us at any rate as far as Palestine and possibly Iraq. The problem obviously would be to get across the canal, but travelling right, we reckoned in the event of total collapse and catastrophe in Cairo, we should be able to do that. It may seem strange to record today that the idea which I personally had at the back of my mind was that if one could get to India, one could also get to China, and that China was likely to be the place of the ultimate resistance in the event of a sweeping German victory. China and Russia in different ways as the natural opponents of Germany and Japan seem to be the ultimate bastions in the event of a Middle East and the British position being totally lost. However, that's a bit of local colour associated with the Great Fire of Cairo.
At that time, was there any tendency of people to look for scapegoats?
I don't remember that in General Headquarters. Of course, it was shortly after this that the top commands were altered, and Auchinleck was replaced by Alexander, and that Montgomery was put in charge of the 8th Army. But I don't recollect. I recollect a sense of relief that probably more coordination would be injected into the conduct of a campaign in North Africa. I think there was a sense that under Auchinleck, the local commanders had been given more initiative, and that they had used it in a less coordinated manner than would have been desirable facing the German and Italian threat. And I think it was recognized that it was likely, and soon found that it was the fact, that that element of overall control would be supplied by would be supplied by Montgomery. It must have been somewhere around that time that I carried out for the General Headquarters, Cairo, a personal reconnaissance of the Qattara Depression, the curious depressed area of salt marsh lying at the southern end of the line at El Alamein, to ascertain whether it was possible for the German armour to execute a flanking movement. And I had the experience of getting to know that very remarkable unit, the long-range desert group, which at that time was based at the oasis of Siwa, was certainly living in close and friendly relationship with the Senussi tribesmen of Siwa, and was exerting its mastery of desert travel in motor vehicles in order to maintain what I mentioned before, the standing surveillance of German routes. There was quite deep penetration for purposes of surveillance of the main roads in Cyrenaica and Tripolitania, with patrols sent out from and returning to and reporting from Siwa. Indeed, it was a small patrol of the long-range desert group that I myself took to the Qattara Depression. We took with us a 3-ton lorry and experimented to see how far we could get with it. We didn't get very far, but as they were experts in digging, we didn't lose the 3-ton lorry. But at any rate, I was pretty satisfied that an outflanking attempt with armour across the depression would be likely to create more difficulties for the attackers than for the defenders.
Do you remember any of the individuals you went with from the LRDG?
I don't remember the individuals in the patrol. I remember the commander. He had just, I think, succeeded Prendergast. Of course, Prendergast had been the creator, Colonel Prendergast had been the creator in the last pre-war years of a long-range desert group, because he had made a hobby, and it was the results were recorded in a book which he wrote. He had made a study of the behavior of desert stand and the techniques of crossing moving sand with a military formation, and at the height of the German advance through Cyrenaica in the spring of 1942, the LRDG had in fact been withdrawn from Siwa to Kufra and crossed the hundreds of miles of a sand sea complete and successfully, due south from Siwa across the moving sand. So their knowledge of the techniques of desert travel worked out in practice.
Was the initiator you referred to Prendergast or Bagnold?
Bagnold was the... you're quite right. It must have been Bagnold who was the originator in peacetime, and Prendergast who was his successor and who was the commander when I was there at the time. Thank you for reminding me. As soon as the line was more or less stabilized at Mersa Matruh, a kind of routine established itself in the Inter-Service Target Committee, of which I was the Army member. And we certainly evolved an effective working relationship. I remember very clearly the RAF member, Wing Commander Long, who had been in Egypt before the war, worked as the agent of a firm dealing in aircraft. He was particularly useful because he had relations with the United States, and the first American reinforcements were beginning to be available in Egypt. And it was important that our advice should be conveyed to them in a form which would make it likely to be accepted and yet would not betray the nature of the source, which was unknown even to at that time, even to the highest American commanders in the Middle East. And Bill Long, Wing Commander Bill Long, had formed a good personal relationship with the Americans, which enabled him very often to sell to them targets which they were reluctant to engage or go in search of, but which we knew from our sources were of particular importance. Then there was the naval member, a Commander Hubbock, with whom I used to exchange wages as to the situation which would be found at the harbours of Benghazi and Tripoli when those harbours were eventually re-entered by our forces. But certainly it worked extraordinarily well, because the potentialities of the arms, of a strike arm, were understood by the air and naval members of a committee. What I was contributing was an understanding of the German supply position from day to day and of its relationship to the battle in North Africa, and also a more detailed study of the implications of the ultra material in their bearing upon individual ships and the utility of one target compared with another. I remember one, I can't exactly date it, but I remember one incident, it must be from those months, when a particular ship was marked down on its return voyage from North Africa to the north side of the Mediterranean, and was in fact effectively engaged and sunk. It was, alas, only after that we heard it was conveying 300 British prisoners of war. It had been a ship which had been important in the supply shuttle, and it was thought that it was worthwhile destroying it empty so as to prevent it from making further shuttle voyages. But that was the kind of tragedy to which one was indirectly and at long range exposed. In the summer of 1942, I began to double my work as Army member of the Inter-Service Target Committee with work for military intelligence MI1A, because Colonel Williams had become, when Colonel Williams became Montgomery's Chief of Staff, I succeeded him, Colonel Williams, as director of that part of military intelligence which was concerned with the study with the German army directly, direct military intelligence about the German army, so that I was doubling the enemy military intelligence role at GHQ for some 4 or 5 months, with my role as the army member, which I didn't terminate or hand over, the army member of the Inter-Service Committee. It was in that period, though rather later, rather towards the end of 1942, that I had a narrow escape from what might have been a humiliating episode in my career as an intelligence officer. The call sign, because of course low-grade intercepts were fed into the machine as much as along with the higher-grade intercepts. The call sign of Field Marshal Rommel, Roro, disappeared from the air for several days consecutively, and this was accompanied by the sort of rumour that can happen in war, that the Field Marshal had in fact been killed. And I prepared what I thought was a very just and detailed obituary of Field Marshal Rommel. I had it on my desk, ready for issue with the next intelligence summary, and for some reason or other decided that evening, which I remember very clearly, to put it into my in-tray for the time being. It was that evening that the call sign Roro reappeared on the air, and I was able to, I accordingly, with relief, tore up the obituary.
It was just instinct,
One shouldn't, negative evidence should never be treated on the same plane as positive evidence, so perhaps it might be argued that I was falling into a logical the same type of logical fallacy as my own colonel had fallen into it, the disastrous misappreciation over the German armour in North Africa. It was immediately after the landing of Torch in November the 5th, was it not, 1942, that the whole perspective of a campaign in North Africa shifted, and it was foreseen that 8th Army would be cooperating in the pincer movement with 1st Army, and that in consequence it would be the central Mediterranean rather than the eastern Mediterranean. Tunisia and Tripolitania rather than Cyrenaica, that would be the vital supply areas for the enemy forces in North Africa. It was therefore decided by my superiors that my unit, that is the unit which supported my inter-service role, would be transferred from Cairo on loan to Allied Force headquarters. And I remember doing a reconnaissance for the transfer in December 1942. There are some anecdotes which are perhaps have some flavour of the atmosphere into which the Americans were injected in 1942-43, which are attendant upon that reconnaissance trip. I flew over, perhaps incautiously, from Cairo to Algiers for the day, and having settled by late afternoon what seemed to me to be the essentials for the transfer a few weeks later, a fortnight later I think it was, of my unit and its accommodation in Allied Force Headquarters Algiers, I found that I had missed the last plane back. The air chief, whose name for the moment escapes me, proved obdurate to my pleas that he might take me on as a passenger in his plane to Cairo, and some kind friend at the RAF, in the RAF at Algiers headquarters, said, "Why don't you go round the other side of the airfield? There's a squadron of American aircraft there on their way to Cairo." So I walked round the circumference of the airfield in Algiers, found the commander of the flight of 15 DC transport aircraft, explained my predicament, and was immediately welcomed on board. Apart from me, the flight was empty. It was heading for transport duties based on the Middle East. That night we spent in the desert due south of Algiers. The following morning, the first officer came back to where I was making the best of things in the fuselage and said to me, "Say, do you know where Castel Benito is?" So I said, well, I had an idea where Castel Benito is, but could I help? So he said, yes, come forward. And I went forward, and by the grace of God, I was able to recognize sufficient of a road system in Tripolitania to bring the flight onto the Castel Benito airfield. We had lunch on the Castel Benito airfield, and the commander announced his intention of making El Agheila that night. I said, but it will be dark before we get there. He said, no, it's not, because we shall get there at 4 o'clock or whatever the time might have been. And I found myself actually having to explain to him that you count so many minutes for each degree of latitude, east or west, plus or minus on the clock. You don't say, was the response to this. And this was a flight of 15 aircraft in the blue, finding its way across to the Middle East, having presumably been brought over, I don't know, by on shipboard into Europe. We landed, the first aircraft in which I was, which was the commander's aircraft, landed in dusk. The others got down safely by following it precisely. You were right, they said. You were right about that. The next day was a half-day's trip to Cairo from El Agheila. And once again I had a visit from the mate, saying, there are 3 airfields shown on our map at Cairo. Which one should we come down at? Well, I worked out that
Session number 10044, reel 6.
Mr. Powell, reel 6.
Well, I worked it out that Heliopolis of those 3 airfields would suit me best, as there was a good tram connection for central Cairo. So at Heliopolis it was that we landed. I tell these rather trivial anecdotes because I think they typified the gauche and amateurish atmosphere which accompanied the Americans and was very evident in Allied Force Headquarters, North Africa. I recollect 2 other instances which illustrate that, both of which occurred when my section was working in Allied Force Algiers. I happened to be accommodated in quarters which were shared by American officers. Indeed, my room, the room in which I slept, was shared by 2 other American officers who were considerably incommoded by my habit of getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning. They were greatly struck by this, that I should be going off to work at headquarters at 4 o'clock in the morning, and offered the comment that they weren't taking the war seriously enough as yet, but clearly we were taking it mighty seriously. The other incident was when Rommel succeeded by, I think it was at the Cassassine Gap in the south of Tunisia, by a side sweep, capturing 50 Sherman tanks. And the British at Allied Force Headquarters were absolutely devastated by this information, to the astonishment of their American colleagues, who said to them, hell, there's lots more where those came from. And then one realized how for what seemed ages we had been fighting the war on a shoestring, and that we knew perfectly well how devastating Rommel could be with any clapped-out British equipment that came into his possession, that he'd soon have it running and facing the other way. But it was typical of the difference in approach, the sense which the Americans brought with them of unlimited resources and a take-it-or-leave-it attitude which accompanied the possession of unlimited resources and the assurance of winning anyhow, someday, somehow. Well, in Algiers, the targeting process was very similar to what it had been in Cairo, but more intensive, since, of course, the sea traverse was relatively short compared with that related to Cyrenaica, and also because obviously the Allied forces were going for a kill and were not so much concerned with survival as we had been in North Africa for the previous year or year and a half. But I remember with similar admiration working with the Royal Navy under A.B. Cunningham. He certainly had a terrific influence for morale upon his headquarter staff. It's different. It was different. I shouldn't use the present tense. But I was always struck how different it was to work with the Royal Navy. You had first of all to work very hard in order to win their confidence and in order to convey that there might be some information which a Brown job had that was of relevance to the operations of the Royal Navy. But when one broke through this initial screen, one couldn't but admire both the efficiency and the dedication with which they worked. And I came greatly to enjoy, even at second hand, the feed-in of material to Admiral Cunningham. When the end of a campaign came, with the ineffectual attempt to continue servicing the remaining German forces in Cap Bon with landing craft, F-boats. I recalled that my unit was only on detachment from Middle East. Since my eyes were by then set on getting to the eastern theatre of war, I announced that was the end of my work in Allied Force Headquarters, that I was going back to my proper station, which was Middle East, and I would be taking back with me what remained of a unit which could no longer utilize the expertise that had been built up over 12 or 18 months in dealing with seaborne communications. Seaborne communications and ultra-material relating to those communications had provided a unique intelligence effort in Middle East and in Allied Forces Headquarters North Africa. But that would be at an end as soon as the war became continental, and as soon, therefore, as the main lines of supply were inevitably land lines of supply, which didn't leave the same traces or form the basis for comparable calculations in the high-grade cipher system which the enemy used. Unfortunately, Director of Military Intelligence Sir Kenneth Strong, had got used to the degree of prestige which he had with his fellow intelligence officers of both nations, deriving from the operations of the inter-service staff. And he was extremely reluctant to accept that there was an end to that phase of the war at any rate. And I remember a blazing row that I had with him, almost pushed to the point of military insubordination. So impatient was I with the failure to appreciate the unique nature of the intelligence material which had hitherto been handled, and the inapplicability of those methods to the handling of the intelligence material which would thereafter illuminate and govern the land battle in Sicily and in the Italian peninsula. Anyhow, I fought my way out. It being one of the characteristics of a British Army at any rate in war, that if you're sufficiently determined, you can go anywhere and do anything that you want to do. Indeed, I think probably this has been a characteristic of a British regular army over a much longer period, and accounts for the achievements in the British Army, historically, of the odd man out, who could always get himself on a detachment, who could always get himself on a job in which his particular talents and his particular insights could be used. One of the characteristics, and I'm reverting, I know, to a theme which I've already spoken about, one of the characteristics which was most marked to me about the British Army in World War II was its readiness to use talent wherever it could find it, and its freedom from snobbishness when confronted with the idiosyncratic, or what the Americans call the oddball. The British Army worked with the material which it had, however curious, however unassimilable. Anyhow, I won my passage back. My passage back was to be recorded in an article contributed by my companion to Blackwood's magazine in 1947 under the title Teaching the Professor. I need not therefore enter into the details, except to say that the basic operation was to draw a 30-ton lorry from Ordnance Algiers for delivery to Ordnance Abbasia Cairo, the delivery to be overland, and that was the first direct overland crossing from North Africa to Middle East, which took place after the Germans surrendered in Cap Bon. And my army assistant, one Major at that time, M.F. Strawn, who had been my intelligence officer in my later days with 9th Armoured Division in Northamptonshire, and had joined me to assist me in the work of the section in Allied Force Headquarters, was not only to be my companion on the journey, but was also to be my instructor on the driving of a 30 hundredweight lorry. It might be worth mentioning how Major Strawn came to be on my staff, because he had been a valued member of the staff of 9th Armoured Division after I left it. There is, however, a habit in the American Army whereby all orders are signed not as in the British Army by a staff officer of the relevant formation, but by the commander. My second request, therefore, forward in my behalf for the posting of Major Strawn to Allied Force Headquarters was signed Eisenhower, and created immense consternation when it arrived at Headquarters 9th Armoured Division, who decided they, of course, couldn't possibly withstand General Eisenhower if it was General Eisenhower who really wanted Major Strawn in Algiers. I have to confess that there was another element of irregularity about this particular journey. I had accumulated in Algiers a great deal of basic material from Uncle Henry. Indeed, I wouldn't swear my Bible oath that I hadn't taken a certain amount of Uncle Henry with me via the desert route between the Middle East and North Africa when I transferred the section. Anyhow, it was part of a section, and it was therefore loaded onto the lorry, which was given the name of Pinafore, the Gilbert and Sullivan name of Pinafore, in a large locked filing cabinet, which received before the end of the journey the sobriquet of What's His Name, because What's His Name in the adventures of a journey was apt to have a personality of his own and move about from one part of the lorry to another, rather like the rogue gun moves about in the ship in Victor Hugo's 1893. The journey, which I will, since the details are for the most part on record elsewhere, I won't waste time with the journey, except to say that I passed out as a driver of a 30-ton lorry by taking the lorry into central Cairo, to the admiration of my companion, and parking it in the Gezira Club. It had been a fantastic journey, 200 miles a day, 16 days, from Algiers to Cairo, backwards in time through the memories of the North African campaign, passing El Agheila, through Benghazi, past Tobruk, through Mersa Matruh, past El Alamein. It was a weird journey backwards through time. But arrived at General Headquarters Cairo, the problem was how to get to the Far East. My brother officer, Major Strawn, not sharing the same predisposition for the Far East, got himself a staff course at Haifa, and subsequently had a distinguished career with the army in the advance up the Italian peninsula. But I was anything but anxious to continue to thrash straw in the Middle East, which was now turning its attention increasingly to the Balkans and to an operation against the Italians in the Dodecanese. I wanted to know none of these things and pestered everyone who could help me for means of getting a transfer eastwards.
What were your reasons for rejecting the Eastern Mediterranean for the Far East?
I should probably, at this stage, recapitulate to the extent of referring to what I called my Christmas appreciations. For each year, 1940, 41, 42, I had written an appreciation as a Christmas present for my senior officers. The one which I wrote in 1940 was not very well received. The burden of that appreciation was that the war could only be won if Russia was on the side of the United Kingdom. Only with the immense resources and strength of the Soviet Union could victory be conceivable in a war which would have to be fought out on the continent with masses of massed armies. I understand that tactful inquiries were made following the submission of that appreciation to ascertain whether I had connections with the Communist Party or other undesirable affiliations. But in the end, the conclusion was reached that this must be another of the idiosyncrasies of this rather extraordinary officer. However, it turned out 1941, the 1941 appreciation, I don't distinctly remember. The 1942 appreciation, however, was of great importance. In that appreciation, I argued that the war could not now be lost in the West, that with the Germans withdrawing from Stalingrad, with the Middle East saved, with the Mediterranean in Allied hands, sooner or later the war, one way or the other, would be won in the West, and that the most effective way of winning the war, indeed the title of this, the rather irritant title of this appreciation, was Peace with Germany Now, a rather remarkable title, perhaps, for a Christmas appreciation written in December 1942 by a staff officer on the strength of GHQ Middle East. The most effective way of winning the war in the West would be to make peace with a Germany whose rulers had clearly failed in their intentions and who could therefore be left to be dealt with by their own people, who would deal with them much more efficaciously than their victorious enemies could do, and much more lastingly, with the result of a settlement in Europe more durable than that which had been imposed in 1919. So in the terms of the First World War, I suppose I would have been classed as a supporter of the Marquis of Lansdowne. But there was the other side to my thesis, and the other side was that the important war for the British Empire was now the war in the Far East, and that it was essential for the survival of the empire, something which I then still regarded as in the realm of practical politics, that Britain and not the United States should reoccupy Burma and Malaya, and that if not the dominant partner in defeating Japan, we should at any rate be seen to be a major partner alongside the United States. For Britain, therefore, it seemed to me that the vital theatre of war now lay in the Far East, and I wanted to get into it. I wanted, as I naughtily put it, to get to Singapore before the Americans. Of course, there was quite a row amongst the recipients of my appreciation, but not for the first time. I was bailed out by the Royal Navy, who said, yes, from our point of view, the future peacetime threat obviously is a threat from the United States. That is the power in the world that we shall have to reckon with in the peacetime scene, and that will be a power which will threaten the naval position of the United Kingdom. So I was imbued, and had for some time past been imbued, with the desire to get into the operations which would culminate in the recovery of Malaya and be part of a run-up to the defeat of Japan. I remember, said he rather defiantly, because it is this kind of event in which memory sometimes plays us false. Hearing that General Wingate was at GHQ Cairo, catching him as he was about to get the plane and insisting on travelling to the airport with him in his taxi, and getting him to promise to take me with him on his second, this was between the first and the second of Achindit expeditions. Why it was that didn't come off, I don't know. It may be, of course, that before he came back east, I had already hitched a lift, so to speak, with General Cawthorne, the Director of Military Intelligence India, who recruited me for the establishment of a joint intelligence committee, India and Southeast Asia, which would work to the Joint Operations Committee, India and Southeast Asia, and form the basis of the SEAC intelligence and Southeast Asia Command planning, against the date when that would be separated and have its own separate existence from India Command. So it was in the light of the work which I had done in the inter-service targeting section that I was recruited for India Command to be Secretary of a Joint Intelligence Committee, India and Southeast Asia. And although I would have gone down to Major in order to get east, I was posted east from Cairo in my then rank of Lieutenant Colonel. I remember the despair of the officer in charge of MIX, that is Military Intelligence Posting Section, when confronted with myself and Major Strawn. He remarked once, so we were told, all my time I spend dealing with officers who want to get promoted. I've got 2 cussed officers here who want to get demoted in order to get themselves taken where they want to go. I think probably Major Strawn didn't drop rank, but I remember intimating that whatever rank I had to drop in order to get into the Far East, I was quite happy to do so. Indeed, I suppose, psychologically in my own personal life, what the war meant to me in terms of self-confidence was that I had 3 times the experience of starting fresh, starting as a private in the army, starting back again after my experience in armoured formations and at the staff college, starting back again at the bottom in the Middle East, and starting in a completely new theatre of war in India and the Far East. There's a certain self-confidence which one gains by being able to tear it up at a stage in one's life and start all over again and still get through. Anyhow, in August 1943, with great relief, and by flying boat once again, I found myself heading eastwards from Cairo to Delhi. I need only record my first night in Delhi. For the train, it was a train from Udaipur, presumably, from the landing point of the flying boat, got into Delhi at a late hour when headquarters was closed. And I had no instructions and nowhere to go. And I remember sleeping in my valise on the station platform at Delhi. I date from that moment, probably romantically, my love affair with India. The love affair which was to keep me in India and in the end to frustrate my desire to be part of the reconquest operation under Lord Mountbatten. But I'll come to that presently. I found myself working directly to General Cawthorne in India Command and as his representative on the Joint Intelligence Committee. A very strong personal rapport sprang up between us. He was a Punjabi and an Australian, dedicated to the Indian Army and its ways, and dedicated to India. And I suppose that his sympathy and his encouragement led me to helped me to devote myself in parallel with the work that I was doing as Secretary of a Joint Intelligence Committee, to both to learning Urdu and to accumulating as deep a knowledge as I could of the earlier and more recent history of India. The initial love at first sight continuously deepened as long as I was in India. And when I came home, finally, in February 1946, it was only because I was then satisfied that there was no future for a person like myself in the post-war army in India. But I remember saying at the time that had the Indian army been going on, I would have stayed in India and gladly left my bones there. But I'm jumping ahead. I'm jumping ahead what seems a huge period of time, but can really be no more than some 6 months. The 6 months, last 3 or 4 months of 43, and the first 2 months of 44. It was at the end of that 6 months that the Southeast Asia Command set up its headquarters at Kandy, and that the work which I had been doing for SEAC as opposed to Indian work would be transferred from India to the Southeast Asia Command. I should add, incidentally, that since I was on the ultra list, I also maintained in India, and India went on with this for several months after the separation of the Southeast Asia Command. I maintained a shadow of the study of seaborne movements by the Japanese, a shadow of that which I had practiced upon German seaborne movements in the Mediterranean. One was, of course, using American decodes. What I believe, the American code name I believe was Purple. But at any rate, there was a mass of ultra-type material concerned with Japanese air and sea movements. And those I processed in the manner that I had been used to processing ultra-material in the Mediterranean theatre. It must have included relatively more information relating to movements of the Japanese Air Force, because I remember it must have been around December 1943, a great row with Lord Mountbatten. I used as Secretary of a Joint Intelligence Committee to do weekly presentations for the higher staff of the Southeast Asia Command. And at this time, operations affecting the Andaman Islands were in consideration. And I did make certain observations on the potential Japanese air effort over the Andaman Islands, which Lord Mountbatten misunderstood as involving an appreciation of British capability, which would naturally be an invasion of foreign territory by an intelligence officer. When the break came, when India was ready to give birth in intelligence terms, in operational intelligence terms, to the Southeast Asia Command, I received a
Session number 10044, Reel 7.
Mr. Powell, Reel 7.
I received a summons to go to see General Lamplow, Royal Marines, who was to be the Director of Military Intelligence of the Southeast Asia Command. He offered me a position on his staff to do roughly the same work as I had been doing in India and to carry it forward during the operations which lay ahead. I declined. I declined because for two reasons, both of which I explained to him. The first was that I was very uneasy in a joint headquarters, which would be joint between the British and the Americans. I had a rooted belief that the jealousy and rivalry between the United States and the Americans rendered
Between
the United States and the British rendered them uncomfortable allies in the Far East. And the second reason was that by then I was deeply involved in India and had become deeply and personally attached to it. Naturally, this being my attitude, General Lamplow said, well, that settles the matter. And I remember marching back across the court of the Imperial Secretariat in Delhi into the Indian wing, Indian Army wing, and marching into General Cawthorne's office. It's all right, I said. What's all right, do you mean? Do you know what they did? Siak asked me to leave India and join them. I said I wouldn't. His face fell. He didn't get on very well with General Lamplow, but he had overcome his prejudices sufficiently for my sake to ensure that there would be a real live job for me with Siak when the changeover took place. However, I declared my allegiance to India, an allegiance which in the event was to decide that I didn't have any part, direct or indirect, in the operations by which Burma, Malaysia and Malaysia were recovered. Upon such threads hang the disappointment of one's major intentions. I became Assistant Director of Military Intelligence, India Command, as a full colonel about that time. And there were two activities in which India was engaged at that time, which were relevant to the war in Burma and further east. The first was that the India Command had an exceptional unit dealing with enemy material. Enemy captured material, weapons and other material, were processed by a section of military intelligence in India, and the Indian Command remained the authoritative source of information upon Japanese war material, the quality and capabilities of Japanese war material. The second activity was perhaps parallel. There came into our possession about that time a recent copy of the Japanese army list. Curiously enough, and it's and it's similar to other strange national characteristics of ours, the Japanese always included in the army list a note of the unit with which each officer was at the time serving. One had therefore only to reorganize the army list in terms of formations in order to create a key with which any officer, if identified dead or alive, could identify the unit and possibly the formation which was on the other side of the line. It's a relic of, it's a memory of the age before the computers. But on hearing of that document, I went into General Cawthorne and asked him for 60 slaves. I was given 60 slaves, that is to say 60 people who would sit at desks in the gymnasium. Sitting at desks in the gymnasium, in a week they transposed by sheer manpower the Japanese army list into what, from the colour of its cover, was thereafter called the Yellow Book of the Japanese Army, which became the interrogation officer's vademecum from then onwards and was constantly kept up to date with supplements. There was a Japanese section in Military Intelligence India which was staffed by officers who had been commissioned, pumped with Japanese, and sent out all raw to work in Japanese intelligence on Japanese material, since, of course, there was an inevitable shortage of officers capable of reading Japanese. These were attached to the India Command, and I made myself thoroughly unpopular by insisting that these officers on arrival should do a month's attachment to the Indian Army with a unit in Delhi, whereby they would at least get to know something about India and about the Indian Army. It was highly unpopular at the time and was also representing as holding up vital intelligence work, but I feel no repentance about it, and I'm sure neither did they when they had that experience. I remained Assistant Director of Military Intelligence India until June, July 1944. It's something which I find almost impossible to believe now, as I reproduce this narrative, that during the entire period, from the landing of D-Day to VJ Day, I was in a sense encapsulated in India. So separate was the Eastern theatre from the European. So back to back were those views of the world, and so inadequate in India at any rate was the coverage, the day-to-day coverage of events in Europe, that I have to state that through all the vicissitudes from D-Day to VE Day, my mind was totally unaffected by the gigantic struggle in which Germany was destroyed by the Allies in Europe. So much so that when recalling all this story recently, I could hardly believe the chronology. In telling the story, for example, to my wife, who happened to be employed in the Chiefs of Staff office in London, it seemed to both of us simply incredible that one could have been so estranged for what is now, I now see in retrospect, was so large a fraction of the total war, that I should have been so completely estranged from the European campaign. Indeed, as I shall presently explain, I wasn't even directly focused, as I had hitherto been, upon the war in Burma, because in July 1944, instead of becoming, which I might at that stage have become, the Deputy Director of Military Intelligence, I became, with promotion to the rank of Brigadier, one of the 3 army members of the 4 members of the Commission on the Post-War Indian Army set up under Lieutenant General Wilcox. The other members were Brigadier Gordon Thompson and Brigadier Cariappa, who was later to be the first Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army. And there was an air member Air Commodore Kingston McLaughlin, with whom I cooperated in 2 books which he published in the later 1940s. He was a regular officer, a regular RAF officer, who had previously studied the Northwest Frontier for the purposes of a report produced on the Northwest Frontier, specifically by General Tucker. So, my staff training, my army experience, and my immersion in India were activated by my duties as a member of that committee. I, in fact, drafted the report. Somebody has to draft a report, and I drafted the report. I don't say that I dictated the report. That would be a very different and untrue statement. But I drafted it, and to that extent I helped in the creation of a report which, so I understand, dominated for a long time the military planning, both of India and of Pakistan, because the copies of the report which were available in Delhi were divided at the partition between the future Pakistan army and the future Indian army. It was, of course, an activity into which my absorption with Indian history entangled me. And I did write for that report what, at any rate up to that time, was the only conveniently available history of class composition and recruitment in the Indian Army. The committee was based in Dehradun, to which we returned for our drafting sessions from extensive travels and tours of investigation, which took us into all the major military establishments and all the military commands, from Peshawar in the one direction to Calcutta in the other direction, so that it was a marvelous survey of India as India was in 1944, 1945. At the same time as this, I was working away at my interpretership in Urdu. I happened to have as my teacher a not undistinguished Urdu poet who was himself a nephew of the most famous of all Urdu poets. Hali, H-A-L-I, is the name. And the two activities, I suppose, complemented one another.
Were you considering at that time the bringing in of more southern peoples into the Indian Army?
Yes, we believed that a gradual loosening of the class composition of the army was both possible and desirable, though it would have taken place much more slowly than I think was envisaged by the successor government. We also envisaged, though there's little point in my giving evidence verbally upon a written document, for there it is, and I've presented my copy of this, which I happen to have. I had two copies. One I gave to Field Marshal Auchinleck, and I never knew what became of that, long after the war. And the other copy has been reproduced for the India Office Library, and also for, I think the RUSI also has a copy. So I won't give verbal evidence on a written document. But certainly, not least under the prompting of Brigadier Cariappa, we looked into all the received wisdom regarding the composition of the Indian Army. What was fundamental about the report and what was to influence my own mind and behaviour 40 years later, when I was spokesman on defence of the Conservative opposition, was the concept of a peacetime army as a basis for expansion. After all, India had exhibited a fantastic example of the expansion of a peacetime army of some 250,000 to 2.25 million of men under arms by the end of the war. And it seemed to us that the logical way to construct a peacetime army was to ask what peacetime army would form the ideal basis for wartime expansion, and at what rate that expansion could take place. Obviously, the one was coordinate with the other. And I think probably that report was, in a way, unique in planning an army down to the smallest detail upon a theory of wartime expansion, a very un-English approach to a regular peacetime army. And it was done down to the smallest detail. We took the view that if we were going to produce a report on the post-war Indian Army, then it was our business also to produce the establishments. And we produced a 2-volume report, and the second volume was a complete establishment of the post-war Indian Army. We also went into such questions as the position of the Viceroy's commissioned officer, the non-commissioned ranks, and the training of Indians as officers in the Indian Army. I suppose those are probably some of the more obsolete parts of the report. But I would think that for 20 years or so, it probably was fairly frequently referred to, both in Delhi and in Karachi. Simultaneously, I was travelling India on my own account because I had learnt to ride a bicycle. I had to go to India to learn to ride a bicycle. In India, one has to learn to ride a bicycle. And it must have been quite a historic moment when my second-in-command in my number 2 launched me on a bicycle at the top of Kingsway and said, "There you are, Colonel, off you go now, you can ride it now." The next morning, however, was not quite so easy. I fell off several times into the next man's veranda on remounting and collided in Kingsway with an underlit bullock cart. But I mastered the bicycle as the ideal method of learning India. And with my Indian servant, I used to travel by myself on my leaves. I remember, for instance, we spent one leave in Gujarat because I was deeply interested in Islamic architecture. And we must certainly have made a curious picture, which I'm afraid wasn't cinematographed at the time, of a brigadier on the bicycle cycling along a bund, followed at several yards' distance by his Punchi, for he came from Punch, a servant with red beard and flowing garb. It was one of his functions to raid the villages through which we passed for eggs and other eatables for picnic. I got very close, I felt, to the underside of India in those months. I was going to say years, but I realized they were no more than months. And that perhaps makes it easier to explain what I meant when I said just now that in 1946, when the war was over, had there been an Indian army in which there was a place for a British officer like myself, I would have stayed in India and spent the rest of my life there. we were in Dehradun when the Hiroshima bomb dropped, and VJ Day had already passed when the report was turned in, I think, to the Viceroy and Commander-in-Chief in October 1945. Shortly after that, after a long interview with the Chief of Staff, I had come to the decision that there would be no future for me in India and in the Indian Army, and all that remained for me to do was still to sit my interpretership examination and come home. I had hoped to come home via Japan and the United States, which I had never visited. And I remember another incident there, because agreement to my doing this was withheld. And I remember telling an American officer of equal rank to myself that I would have liked to come back westabout, but that permission wasn't forthcoming. He said, "Why didn't you write your name across it?" A very interesting illustration of a different apprehension of the situation of an officer at brigadier level between the two armies.
You've been talking about your love affair with India. Can you tell me what the reason is? Was it because of the culture or because of the sense of a great empire that you had?
I wouldn't need to use the word love affair if I could explain it. For a love affair is something you can't explain, and that's why I like to choose this metaphor. But the unconstrained wonder of it, this unbelievable phenomenon of a vast continent with tumultuous history and a marvelous variety of languages and peoples, cohering apparently effortlessly by reason of the improbable connection with it of a few thousand people from a group of islands in the North Atlantic. This is one of the wonders of the world. It's a phenomenon, and there was the phenomenon, and one was still able to live in it. It was like being, for an analogy, it was like being with Alexander in his army when he travelled from Greece to India. A miracle happened, and the miracle was still continuing to happen, despite the political accompaniment. But it was still there on the ground in India.
When you were doing your work with this committee on the Indian Army, did you give much consideration to the question of the defections from the Indian Army in Southeast Asia to the so-called Indian National Army?
No, I remember the Subhash Chandra Bose story and all that, yes. I remember that, and I remember the amnesty which was given, was it not at the end of 45 or the beginning of 46? But I think if the matter had been raised in the committee, we would have said one of the assumptions which we are making in constructing this army is that it is an army which enjoys the support of the population. Subhash Chandra Bose, after all, was a manifestation of Japanese imperialism. It was like the famine in 42, it was Japanese made. The defeat of the European in Southeast Asia and the defeat of the European by the Japanese had repercussions right across Southern Asia. And Subhash Chandra Bose was one of those. He belongs with the history of Japan more than with the history of India. There's a defiant statement.
I think many would agree.
He doesn't belong with 1857. It's not part of a story of 1857.
You mentioned Wingate. Was that the only time that you met him?
Yes.
How long did you meet him for?
I suppose no longer the time than it takes to get from the centre of Cairo to the airport.
Were you able to form any impression of him at all, as a man?
I was attracted by him, and he seemed to me a man under whom I would be happy to serve, especially if he would be the means of taking me where I then thought I wanted to go.
What was there about him that attracted you to him?
I liked his decisiveness, and I liked his special personality. He was hardly the very model of a normal regular officer, not even given that the British Army is, as I've suggested, a not unhappy home for idiosyncrasies. But I don't have a very clear picture. And I think my idea was, here is a show that's going on, and here is a show which one might be able to join. This is an opportunity not to be missed, if it can be grabbed going by.
Reverting to Egypt for a moment, one reads the literature that's been produced by people like Olivia Manning and Lawrence Durrell about this period in Egypt. Does the kind of atmosphere which they create in their novels, do you think it accurately reflects what it was like to be in Cairo and Alexandria in those days, do you think?
I can't help you as I haven't read the novels. However, this you do prompt me to say, that there was a great difference in my situation in Egypt and my situation in India. In Egypt, I was still in the British Army. I was still consciously a part of that army to which belonged the Royal Warwickshire Regiment and the Budbrook Depot of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, except that a piece of that army happened to be fighting on Egyptian soil or on the borders of Egypt against the European enemy. In India, although I was still British service, I was British service in India, British service as a component with the Indian Army. I was no longer part of the Home Army. I was no longer part of an army of occupation, an army in terrain where a campaign was being conducted.
Session number 10044, Reel 8.
Mr. Powell, Reel 8.
In India, I belonged to a different stage play, a different drama, a drama to which belonged Lord Lake, Arthur Wellesley, the soldiers of the first half of the 19th century, to a long history. But it was not an army of occupation in the middle of a campaign.
Coming on to the work that you did in intelligence, how much use did you find that the commanding officers made of the intelligence material that they were being fed with?
I would have thought that it was a vital part of the operational decisions, certainly which were taken in the attack by air and sea upon enemy communications. But I would say that the land battle, the conduct of a land battle, was influenced by well-founded appreciation of enemy capabilities and the enemy's supply situation. Indeed, it might well be that the timing of the Battle of El Alamein was influenced by a calculation of the potentialities of supply of Rommel's forces and of the stocks and reserves which they had in their control. A mention of that reminds me of another little event which links my Egyptian with my Indian experience. When Mersa Matruh fell, I predicted that the Germans would reinstate the railway from Tobruk, and that in a very short time they would have the railway working and rely upon it as their main line of supply for the forward troops. This was treated with some levity by those whom I so advised, until it turned out from the evidence from Ultra that in fact they had got the railway working and had imported diesel locomotives for the purpose. On my arrival in India, therefore, one of the first questions which I asked was about the Burma-Siam Railway. I said, I would assume the Burma-Siam Railway is complete. Complete, said my informants. Not at all. It will be months yet. I said, what is your evidence for that? Oh, they said, we have evidence in the form of air reconnaissance. Can I see the evidence, please? And so they produced the evidence, and it showed the points which had been reached in the construction of the railway at different dates. It is true that the last of those points was accurately pinpointed on the map, but it happened to be the point at which the railway went off the photograph. Having drawn attention to this logical mistake, I then said it is my opinion that the railway has now reached Moulmein. I said that in the week in which the railway did reach Moulmein. I think Moulmein is the junction I want. So that's a little experience which shows how one's concentration upon a fairly technical form of supply and transport makes one's mind lively to possibilities in other theatres.
I presume that working in intelligence, you found that it was a very stimulating activity in the sense that the conclusions one drew were very quickly proved true or false. In contrast to a lot of academic work where very often that's not the case.
I wouldn't have phrased the question quite in that way. That's very much a politician's response. Because in dealing with intelligence material, the question you're asking is not what will happen, but what is now. And you test the reliability. You form your judgment about the material for its truthfulness now. The items add together of a picture which exists now. To draw deductions from that picture as to what will be the case next week or next month is not the business of military intelligence. It's true military intelligence can say those forces located there could move in X days with so many days' supplies behind them to point Y. No doubt. But then one is still describing what exists at the moment. One is not erecting hypotheses which fall to be tested by events so many weeks or months ahead. It is what forces, and forces of what capability, does the enemy have where? What is he doing now? What has he got now? Who is he? Where is he now? That is the business of intelligence.
But what happens in the immediate future can test the reliability of your estimates of the present situation.
I don't think the manner in which the reliability of sources is tested is quite by that sort of experimental verification backwards. I think it is the coherence of one piece of information with other pieces of information. If you have an intelligence report from Athens, for example, which is simply incompatible with the rest of what you know from other sources of what is happening in Athens, then you will be skeptical of that piece of information and of that source. You're not in the business of waiting for 2 or 3 months to find out what the situation is in Athens. So that the tests of veracity applied are non-experimental. They are tests for coherence and tests for consistency.
In the intelligence work that you were doing in North Africa, was the individual character and quality of each individual enemy division, did that come through in your intelligence estimates?
No, only insofar as the commander was concerned. But then, from the German point of view, North Africa was an exceptionally one-man show. And the personality of Rommel did have certain predictable aspects. In Burma, looking at the Japanese army, the predictability related not to individuals, but to the Japanese army. And certainly the Japanese army, as such, had certain habits, certain ways of proceeding, from which it didn't depart, and which it maintained with a rigidity which was almost incredible. For example, I recall the dispatch of a division into Burma. This must have been in 1944. And I remember predicting that that division will be broken up and we shall find bits of it in the Arakan, in Imperial, and on other fronts. And that prediction was borne out. And I made the prediction simply because the curious thing is that when the Japanese sent in a reinforcement, instead of using it like the Germans to create a Schwerpunkt, they nearly always seemed to tear it up into elements which were often as small as a battalion or even a company. You could find companies from the same battalion at widely separate points. Now, these were characteristics of the Japanese and their behavior which one gradually got to know. But they were extraordinarily predictable in their tactical behavior, in their movement behavior.
And you're going to relate that to Rommel in comparison?
No, I'm instituting a contrast between the national characteristics, the general characteristics of a Japanese, and the personal characteristics of an individual German commander.
What were his characteristics?
He had an exceptionally fine rapport with his troops, with his German troops. And he had an exceptional sense for the weaknesses of his opponents. I think probably if you had asked Rommel the question you've just asked me, he would probably have given you character sketches of several of the divisional and corps commanders by whom he was faced. But then I think that was one of Rommel's characteristics. He was he engaged in hand-to-hand fighting, so to speak.
It's interesting that you should have made that point about Japanese rigidity, because some people have commented on what they see as the same characteristic on the part of the Germans.
Well, the Germans had it, but to a much less extent than the Japanese. The Germans were not so much predictable as disciplined. Their discipline, it was their discipline and their training which gave them a degree of predictability, which possibly they found we lacked.
It's interesting in this regard that the Germans never went in for units like the Long-Range Desert Group and commando units, special forces and irregular forces.
I think this is more properly accounted for from the fact that the Germans were nearly always in a long-term position of superiority. After all, in North Africa, we were in a position of inferiority, numerical inferiority, even vis-à-vis the Italians, right from the beginning. Now, intelligence, it's one of the characteristics of intelligence that it is the weapon of the aggressed. It is the weapon of the weaker side. And I had a striking verification of this in North Africa, because before we occupied Tobruk or Benghazi, I was literally the only person on the Allied side who knew where you could bring a ship alongside. I knew what the water was, what the draft was. I knew where the wrecks were. I knew the capacity of the sheer legs. I knew what was needed to be known. The day after we occupied Benghazi, I could whistle for it. They were there, they could find out. Intelligence is the arm of the weak, the arm of those who are aggressed, who make up, to some extent, for the inferiority of the aggressed party by greater knowledge. And certainly in the Mediterranean, we made up for our weakness in the air, in Malta, to a staggering extent, by the superiority of our information. The aggressor is going to find out. He's going to be there. He conducts, as you might say, a reconnaissance in force.
Turning from intelligence matters to political matters in the war, have you any reflections on the effect of the Second World War on political attitudes of the serving British soldier, in particular as reflected in the 1945 election result?
I didn't have much political conversation, even with brother officers, let alone with other ranks, in the years that I was in Egypt or in India. I'm therefore speaking largely introspectively when I say that I think the soldiers, the soldiery, were aware that Churchill had been an important factor in their victory, and indeed he might have saved them from having been betrayed, but that only made it the more important that no one should in peacetime inherit authority from wartime achievement. There was, I think, a determination which the troops shared with the public at large, and a very English instinct to move against excess of authority and prestige. This made it possible to distinguish sharply between Winston Churchill, the man, and Winston Churchill, the conservative. or the leader of a Conservative Party, which he became in 1940.
Did the 45 election result take you by surprise personally?
No. Because I assumed that there would be a reaction against the war and all that, and against a Conservative Party riding into office on the back of military victory. I hope that isn't too drastic a metaphor.
Whilst you were in North Africa, did you come across the phenomenon which has become known as forces parliaments?
Tell me about it.
Which were kind of talking shops for troops to talk about politics and the future form that Britain was going to take politically and socially after the war.
I must have been quite completely insulated from all this. Perhaps I should add, going right back to my service in the ranks, that there was certainly no effort in those months, which is October 39 to January 40, I was about to use the word indoctrination, but that's a very strong word. I remember no effort to present the war case, the war aims to the troops. What I do happen to remember was that the history of a regiment was taught to the men.
Did you attend such classes?
Yes, I distinctly remember classes in regimental history at the end of 1939, and regimental history based upon the battle honours of the regiment.
Were they well taught?
Better than not taught at all.
Do you think it helped to create an esprit de corps?
That would be putting it very high. I think it was the army treating its recruits, militiamen though they might be, wartime material they might be, as they would treat their recruits in time of peace. In that sense, they were being treated respectfully. We weren't just a number. It wasn't infantry regiment number 123. We weren't just a slice of population drafted into one place, which might just as well have been drafted into another place. To that extent, I repeat my expression, I think the recruits and those under training were treated with a degree of respect.
You said something earlier off the record about the war ending with a blank.
My war, yes.
Can you explain what you meant by that exactly?
I do think it is extraordinary. I didn't think it so at the time, because as you go on living, the shape of events isn't clear to you. But in retrospect, I do find it very strange that out of a war which for me lasted from October 39 to February 46, two and a half years, yes? Is that right? I do find it strange in retrospect that out of a war which for me lasted 6.5 years, no less than 2.5 were spent in a way out of the war. concentrating upon scenes, upon a theatre, which was part of a general history of centuries and not directly involved in continuing warfare, and that my mind should have been able to concentrate so intensely upon India, its present and its future, while Europe was being pulverized. Japan, of course, was pulverized, but then the length of time involved in that between May and August 1945 was not really so significant. But I hadn't realized, I've lived so many years since the war, unconscious of how much of the war, how much of my war service which left a lasting imprint upon me, and indeed service which gave me my honorary rank of brigadier, was service outside the theatres of war.
I was interested earlier on, when in the interview, in what you said about the Second World War as in many senses a continuation of the First World War, because so many people have said to me that they regarded the Second World War as something very special and isolated from other wars.
Well, certainly to me, the Second World War was seen coming for 5 years, and that in itself tends to indicate that I regarded it as in some sense a resumption where war left off in November 1918, and probably that was a point of view which was shared in Germany quite widely. But the picture of war which one had was the picture which had been so vivid in the years immediately after 1918, even to someone born in 1912. The picture of war was the picture of the trenches. It was the picture of war as it was in 1918, the picture of war as it was when an infantry officer's expectation of life was 3 weeks. And if that war was being resumed, if that war was being resumed against the same opponent, if it was being resumed on the same terrain in the continent of Europe, where else was one to look to imagine what it would be like? The phony war, well, that was phony. It was not a refutation of one's notions. It was simply a deferment of one's notions. Does that make sense?
Yes, but many people have said, regard the Second World War as not essentially fighting against the same enemy that they were fighting against in the First World War because of Hitlerism being so special.
Yes. I find that question an interesting one for a curious reason. I was recently in Berlin, and I was taken round by a guide who was imbued with the Imperial Berlin, of which so much was still to be seen, or so much could still be evoked. And I realized that my generation, even my generation born too young to be in the First World War, had regarded Imperial Germany as the enemy. It was a Germany which was bent upon conquest, a Germany which was bent upon domination, a Germany which was proud of its victories and determined to build new victories upon them. That was the enemy. And that was the sort of enemy that England feared and fought in the First World War. And I realized that although, of course, I detested as satanic the German regime after 1933, it was still Germany, as powerful, aggressive, dominating, imperial. That was the enemy for me, and still is.